Who is Elmyr? Histories of an Art Forger. Written and performed by Max Horbury. 1. The Hungarian Art Dealer. Perhaps it never happened. Asked about it years later, Elmyr de Hory said he was wandering up 4th Avenue in search of French paper from before the war. It was a cold New York January day, 1948. The small Hungarian man was smartly dressed in a suit, his hair carefully combed. He had kind eyes and a smile that would often curl the side of his mouth, giving him an air of boyish mischief. But today there was no smile. De Hory dipped into a used bookstore, searching for what he needed. He found 2 large French books from the 1920s, views of Paris and Gothic cathedrals. Once he got home, he flicked to the blank pages in the back, and with a razor, sliced the empty sheets from the books. Now he had the perfect paper. It was aged and had the subtle watermark that showed it was pre-war and French. And then he began to draw. In ink, he drew the unmistakable lines of Pablo Picasso. 5 years earlier, Picasso had made a sculpture of a man holding a lamb in his arms. De Hory formed the shape of that image. He did it again in watercolor paint, as a gouache. With this small piece, he went to Pearl's galleries and introduced himself to the owner. Klaus Pearls was a well-known dealer in New York, and since emigrating from Germany, had established himself as a leading authority on the School of Paris. He was intimately familiar with Picasso's work, which he had been selling since before Picasso was a famous name. De Hory presented Pearls with his painting and said it had been made by Picasso as a study in preparation for the well-known sculpture. Pearls looked it over and recognized the subject. De Hory had sold a few small forgeries in Europe, but this was his first time in America. He had selected a prominent dealer who was an expert in the very subject De Hory had chosen to fake. Pearls said he would look it over for a few days. Since he had presented it as a study, De Hory hoped that the fake would be recognizable, but also that it wouldn't be scrutinized too carefully. If something looked a bit off, maybe it could be explained away. It was just a preparation for a sculpture. When De Hory returned to the gallery, he brought the drawing with him as well. Pearls bought them both. He paid $250 for the drawing and $750 for the watercolor. How did De Hory feel? Striding through Midtown with $1,000 in his pocket. In 1948, that was quite a lot of money. Several months' wages. Did he feel relieved to have the money? Thrilled to have pulled it off? Or perhaps he felt a small sense that if his art could fool the best dealers in New York, maybe his work was just as good as that of the artists he was impersonating. That's how it all began. Or at least, that's the story that De Hory tells. Perhaps it's actually true. This is the story of an art forger who crisscrossed the country and made enough forgeries that art historians are still trying to untangle his mess today, determine which pieces are real and which are fake. But if this is a story about an art forger, it is also a story about deception, of half-truths, and outright fictions. A story about the story he told. Many years later, in front of film cameras, he would declare, "I never offered a painting or a drawing to a museum who didn't buy it, that never refused one. Never." "Take a Modigliani by him," he said to the cameras, that mischievous smile flickering in the corner of his mouth, "and take a Modigliani by Modigliani, and show them to a group of the world's leading experts, curators, and dealers. If any of them recognize which one is which, I am ready to make a great gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and they can hang it next to some other Modiglianis who are possibly also by me." His tale sent the art market into a panic. Dealers and curators warily glancing at their collections and wondering, is there an Elmyr de Hory in our midst? This is a story about an art forger. But it's also the story of the biographer who brought de Hory to fame and became the victim of his own tales. The Texan oil millionaire who dreamed of building his own museum and discovered his collection was not what it seemed. The art dealers who tried to hunt down de Hory's fakes and change the art market in the process. And it's the story of the young American who dedicated himself to safeguarding de Hory's legacy, only to find out that the story you get is not always the story you want. It's a story about the stories others told about him. What's real? What's myth? Who is Elmyr de Hory? It depends on who you ask. What is undeniably true is that earlier that month, Elmyr de Hory had his first exhibition in America. There's a review of it in the January 1948 edition of Art News. De Hory had arrived only a few months earlier, but Lilienfeld Galleries put on a 2-week exhibition of his work. The New York Gallery was prestigious and had exhibited the art of many well-regarded European painters, such as Monet and Renoir. It was a promising achievement for this newly arrived artist. It was not a success. The one-paragraph review in Art News described the lively realism, reckless paint, and lush colours that strike the well-known chord of the School of Paris, as do his subjects, French ports, the bridges of Paris, harlequins, and facile portraits. In a city exploding with the energy of abstract expressionism, this was a polite way of saying nice, but old-fashioned. Artists like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko were turning the New York art world on its head. A year later, Life magazine would run an article about Pollock with the headline, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" His wild and colourful drip paintings, full of chaos and aggression, were like nothing anyone had seen. The art world was undergoing a transformation, and it would be impossible to go back. In Europe, Cubism had come and gone as it splintered perspectives and warped figurative representation. Dadaism and Surrealism had become conventional. By the late 40s, artists were abandoning the concept of representation altogether, abstracting emotion. Meanwhile, de Hory was painting little harbour landscapes, Parisian bridges, and watercolour harlequins. It was already a few decades out of style and seemed uninspired. De Hory sold only one painting. He blamed a bad economy and, he said, a heavy New York snowstorm prevented people from attending. After the exhibition closed, he found himself owing money to the gallery. It proved to him how insecure and unjust the art market could be. His pieces, he thought, were just as good as the Picassos and Chagalls from the turn of the century that were now selling for a fortune. With their names, those paintings would sell. But with his name, no one was interested. But what if he made a drawing and put someone else's name on it? Would that prove he was just as good? Sometimes we tell stories about ourselves. Who is Elmyr? If a painting hangs in a museum for long enough, de Hory would later say, it becomes real. And what about a lie? If it's repeated enough times, by enough people, over and over, does it one day become real? History can be fragile. After this success with the fake Picassos, de Hory said, he sold to Pearl several more times. This time he faked actual drawings, not just studies. He would turn up every so often and would say he was just back from a trip to Paris with some new items. He tried out several other galleries in New York too, and began to use a succession of fake names. Baron Herzog, Baron Hory, Louis Cassot, Baron de Beauhardy, Elmyr Laszlo, and Elmyr von Hory, Uri, Uri, and de Hory. The list of names may go on for pages. The two names he used the most, based on records from the time, were Elmyr de Hory and Elmyr Reynal. He would embellish his story. He was an aristocrat, he said, whose family owned a large collection of post-impressionist and modern paintings. He spun tales of twice being captured by the Nazis during the war, each time managing to escape. Now, he would say, he was forced to sell his family collection to get by. They were the only pieces he had managed to save from the Russian occupation of Hungary. It was all he had left, but sadly he would have to sell them. After the war, the character of the European aristocrat fallen on hard times, forced to sell off their family heirlooms, was not an uncommon story. It just happened, in this case, not to be true. But it was irresistible. Dealers love a good story to go with the artwork. It can make the piece more intriguing and more attractive to a potential buyer. Dealers fell for his European charm, and de Hory relished the success. The secret thrill that his works were passing as the greats was intoxicating, and eventually he decided to move on to a new town. He went where many people go when they yearn for the seductive thrill of validation from strangers. He went to Los Angeles. He explored the galleries of Beverly Hills, and curious to see if he could pull it off, tried forging new artists. He studied reproductions of Henri Matisse, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Amedeo Modigliani, and made drawings in their style. De Hory said he sold a few pieces to Earl Stendhal, a huge figure in the California art world, largely responsible for introducing many modern masters to the West Coast art scene. One day, Stendhal apparently asked de Hory if he happened to have something cubistic. With feigned indifference, Stendhal said he personally had no interest in it, but his wife had a little collection and might like something. De Hory pretended to search his memory. You know what? As it so happens, he did have one. Just one. But he was very busy and leaving town the next day, he said, trying to match Stendhal's strategic ambivalence. Two men performing a game of I don't care chicken, careful not to blink first, bluffing their way to a better deal. De Hory would try to bring him the piece in the morning, but only if he had time. Of course, he rushed back to his hotel and got to work. De Hory always created brand new works in the style of an artist. It is actually surprisingly rare for forgers to copy existing works. Instead, they will invent an apparently undiscovered piece. De Hory would take a recognizable subject and create something new. If anything looks off, it can be explained. All artists have off days. Many pieces discovered later are experiments and mistakes, works that didn't quite come out right. Is it a good fake or a bad original? Through this crack of ambiguity, forgers slip past. A work in the style of can be forever up for debate. And who doesn't want to discover a little-known piece by a major artist? When he finished his cubist drawing, de Hory said he held the paper close to the light bulb of the bedside lamp. He needed the ink to dry, but was careful not to let the paper burn. The next day, Stendhal again pretended to be uninterested, playing the part of the underwhelmed dealer, unimpressed and impatient. He bought it for $500. Stendhal likely thought he had gotten one over on de Hory, tricked him into selling cheap. He might sell it at a handsome profit, thinking he had fooled the small Hungarian art dealer he'd met in LA. But whatever the price, it was, in the end, de Hory fooling him. De Hory liked that. For the next few years, de Hory travelled across the country. He was always moving, eager to visit a new city and try selling to more galleries. His pieces were valuable, and the prices irresistibly low. Dealers were charmed by this entertaining young Hungarian baron. When he got money from his forgeries, he spent it quickly on keeping up appearances. He settled for a little while in Louisiana. New Orleans reminded him of Europe, and he claimed he made friends with the playwright Tennessee Williams and the writer Robert Rourke. De Hory sold a few of his own works and eventually got a job restoring some paintings in City Hall. They were historical pieces depicting the Civil War. For his effort, he was profiled in the Times-Picayune in September 1950. His life, it said, was a storybook affair. The article described de Hory as a French-born Hungarian who was the great-great-grandson of Prince Nicholas Esterhazy. De Hory told the paper that in the Second World War he was returning from Africa to France for military service when his boat was torpedoed. He claimed to have escaped the Nazis twice and been jailed briefly by the Russians. To the painter, De Hory is quoted as saying, "The New Orleans scene is stimulating, and life here too, as I see it, is stimulating artistically and intellectually." Consider how brazen it was for him to be forging art, by this time on an expired visa and passport, and happily profiled in a newspaper under the dramatic headline, "Kicked around by Nazis, Reds, artist here to redo paintings." A large photo of De Hory shows him slim and elegant, staring off into the middle distance like a war hero. From New Orleans, he went on to sell to galleries in Kansas City and St. Louis, and traveled to Chicago. He faked works in the style of André Derain and Maurice de Vlaminck. Several galleries to which De Hory claimed he sold forgeries told me they had no record of a sale by De Hory, even under a fake name. Maybe De Hory exaggerated. Maybe the galleries don't want to admit to falling for a faker. Forgery was becoming a sustainable way of life. It was an easy source of income. Drawings were simple to pull off, and since they didn't sell for much, dealers were more inclined to believe they were real. But De Hory's appetite for a challenge was growing. He wanted to fake an oil painting. It would sell for more, and it was, as he later put it, an important development in my career. Oil would be more of a technical challenge than a drawing or watercolor. The scam would be much tougher to pull off. If he could slice aged paper out of old books, canvas would prove much harder. He had to find cheap antique paintings and remove the paint before doing his own. Then he had to make the paint appear old. While De Hory could stain paper with tea to make it appear aged, oil paint takes a long time, often years and years, to fully dry. Dust ingrains itself into the paint and along the crevices of thicker brushstrokes. Then, once it's dried, the oil develops tiny cracks over the years. Dust and dirt get into those cracks too. It's like old wallpaper that seems to absorb the dust of many decades. To get the cracked look, he could bake the painting or apply a certain varnish. De Hory made a painting in the style of Amedeo Modigliani. The Italian painter was famous for his portraits with elongated features, long necks, and enigmatic eyes, at once opaque and vulnerable. De Hory painted a young girl. To test whether it would pass for the real thing, he placed it on the wall and invited his neighbour over, the actor Montgomery Clift. Without highlighting the painting, he wanted to see if Clift would notice it. De Hory later told his biographer, "He thought it was wonderful. I wouldn't sell it to him, of course, because he was a friend, and in case to protect myself, I had only thus far sold to dealers." It is unclear if this story is true, nor is it clear whether Marilyn Monroe attended one of De Hory's parties in New York as he claimed. De Hory, already prone to exaggeration, was a shameless name-dropper. The painting was barely 2 months dry before he took it to the Nouveau Gallery in New York, he claimed. It was not nearly enough time, but he needed the money. Since he had known Paris in the 1930s, he could practically invent a realistic story on the spot about how he had come to acquire the piece. Provenance, the story of how the work got from the artist to the seller, is strongest when based on photographs, receipts, letters, and catalogues. But De Hory had to convince with charm and intrigue. He would name the artist's friends, mistresses, dealers, and well-known collectors. He would invent a provenance that, for example, this particular drawing by Modigliani had been given to De Hory by the wife of Moez Kissling, the artist who shared a studio with Modigliani. Modigliani was an easy target, and De Hory forged paintings in his style frequently throughout his life. Modigliani produced a tremendous amount of work informally. As the Italian artist sat in cafes in Paris, he would sketch. By some estimates, Modigliani did as many as 100 a day, and would often simply hand them out as gifts or payment, making much of his work difficult to trace, thus easier to forge. In 1920, Modigliani died from tubercular meningitis at the age of 35. The Nouveau Gallery looked over De Hory's fake Modigliani painting and bought it for $6,000. Fooling dealers, De Hory thought, was fair game. If they fell for it, it just confirmed his belief in his talents and proved their ignorance. He would later say, "If they don't know the difference, they should be selling sausage or hosiery in the market instead." He felt that dealers only seemed to pay attention to the name of the artist, not the art itself. It was proof to him that these dealers didn't know what they were looking at. Referring to Picasso, de Hory said, "It never existed that a painter was able, with one movement of his hand, what necessarily didn't involve more than 10 seconds. That movement of the hand transformed in gold." In other words, Picasso could paint anything, and it would sell for a fortune, just because it was by Picasso. De Hory thought if people liked his paintings, why should the name signed in the corner make a difference? Putting somebody else's name on the art was a way to bypass that ignorance, he thought. De Hory said, "My opinion about experts is that it's something far too overestimated and shouldn't even exist. It should not exist that one single person makes a decision about what's good and what's bad." Praise meant little from a dealer who didn't know better. De Hory wanted more. He needed concrete proof that his work was just as good as those he imitated. Then, one day, de Hory got his chance. He said that in the spring of 1951, he met Paul Rosenberg. Rosenberg was Pablo Picasso's dealer. He had established Picasso's reputation in the US and is seen by many as responsible for Picasso's legend as the greatest artist of his time. De Hory had an idea. A unique opportunity was in front of him. As he would recall later, "I knew it was dangerous, but suddenly I wanted a challenge. If my drawings were good enough for such a man, then it meant that in their quality they were certainly as valuable as Picasso's. It's a sort of recognition by the highest authority." De Hory made 5 drawings in the style of Picasso's mid-20s classical period. If Rosenberg, the ultimate expert, couldn't tell the difference, mistook a de Hory for a Picasso, then that was the proof he needed. He would be as good as the real thing. He had always excused his forgeries by saying they were done out of necessity. A broke painter who needed money was simply using his craft to get by. Now his ambition had outgrown his circumstances. According to de Hory, Rosenberg bought all 5. Then, in 1952, for whatever reason, de Hory went back to Los Angeles and decided to quit making forgeries. Maybe his sale to Rosenberg had given him the confidence he needed. He would try once again to make a name for himself, using his own name. No more hiding behind famous artists. But he had grown comfortable with how easy it was to sell his forgeries. He was used to that feeling of acceptance and praise. Trying to sell his own work would be a very different experience. Abraham Bradius had a theory without any proof. In the 1930s, he was a leading scholar of 17th century Dutch art, and his theory revolved around Johannes Vermeer, one of the greatest European artists of the 17th century. Vermeer was known for a small number of paintings. He represented everyday people with a divine naturalism that looked almost photographic. Like his modest portrait of a maid pouring milk, light cascading in from the window. Vermeer's biographical details remain mysterious, with little in the way of historical documents. In the 1930s, Bradius had a theory that there was a lost period of Vermeer's life. It was early, he thought, when Vermeer was developing his style and painting religious scenes inspired by Caravaggio. But what good is a theory without proof? And then, as if by magic, a painting appeared attributed to Vermeer. The supper at Emmaus showed a resurrected Jesus breaking bread. It looked nothing like Vermeer's well-known works, such as Girl with a Pearl Earring, but it had elements reminiscent of Caravaggio's own rendition of the same scene. It was exactly what Bradius had hypothesized. Here was his proof. Bradius declared it the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft. But the painting had been made not by Vermeer in the 17th century, but in the 1930s by the Dutch art forger Han van Meegeren. Art forgery has existed for centuries. Even as far back as 1496, Michelangelo, who was 21 years old at the time, tried to age one of his marble statues so he could sell it as an antique. By the time the cardinal in Rome who'd bought it realized it was a fake, Michelangelo had become a famous artist. The dealer who sold it was delighted to take it back and sell it as an original. Forgery popped up here and there for the next few hundred years, but the first time a forger truly caused scandal was when Han van Meegeren painted fake Vermeers. Van Meegeren heard about Bradius's theory that there was a lost era of Vermeer's art. He knew he couldn't replicate anything like Vermeer's known pieces, but maybe he could paint a fake that would fit into this unknown period of Vermeer's life. The result had nothing of Vermeer's ethereal naturalism, but it was from a young painter who was developing his style. Of course it looked different. When Bradius declared the painting an absolute masterpiece, Van Meegeren kept at it. Now he only needed the paintings to look like the first one he'd done. Van Meegeren had invented an entire period of Vermeer's work, and he continued to fake more. We might never have known about Van Meegeren had he not sold one of these fakes to the Nazi Hermann Göring, Adolf Hitler's number 2 man. Later, when the Second World War was over, Van Meegeren was put on trial for treason. He had sold a piece of cultural heritage to high-ranking Nazis. Van Meegeren, potentially facing the death penalty, came clean. But no one believed him. Running out of options, Van Meegeren needed to prove his case. So, to show he could, he painted a fake Vermeer. With this and some early uses of scientific testing, Van Meegeren avoided execution. He had gone from Nazi collaborator to folk hero. Shortly after he was sentenced to jail for forgery, he died from a heart attack. The year he died, Van Meegeren, the man who'd made fools of the art world and the Nazis, was one of the most popular people in the Netherlands. A poll put him second behind the newly elected Prime Minister. Sometimes, there are stories we want to hear, stories that some people are happy to tell us, stories we are happy to tell ourselves, even if we know they might not be true. After he quit making forgeries, Elmyr de Hory said he got a small apartment in LA. Putting on his best suit, he made his way around various galleries. As he ate old bread and went for meals at a burger place on Hollywood Boulevard, he felt it was an embarrassing new low for this aristocrat who had come to the US to make his mark on the art world. He struggled. Interest in his own work just wouldn't come. He found an interior design store. They were looking for some seascapes and still life pieces. De Hory thought it was a little mundane and kitsch, and the people from the store were rude to him. But it was money. He needed it. De Hory would spend his days trying to sell to galleries, but he would always end up at the interior design store. Over and over, still life after still life. He could never understand why his work failed to sell. If only he had been born earlier, he thought. Wishing to be born to an earlier generation is a common refrain among frustrated artists. It is even more common among art forgers, who often have great technical abilities, but find their work dismissed as old-fashioned and unoriginal. From that frustration, forgers will put themselves into the era they feel they belong. But those who yearn to be a part of an earlier time tend to underestimate how much they themselves are a product of that time. What is radical in one generation tends to become convention in the generations that come after. When a barrier is broken, it remains open for everyone who follows. As de Hory struggled to sell, a man from the interior design store asked if he would do a series of pink poodles. There was a woman who was quite taken by the idea and was interested in commissioning some poodle portraits rendered in a pinkish palette. Disgusted by the suggestion, de Hory refused. But after some time, the offer for more money superseded his distaste, and he painted a series of pink poodles. Later he would laugh about it, calling it his pink poodle period. At the time, he didn't find it so funny. Soon, the interior design store also lost interest. They already had more pieces by him than they could sell. With his rent due, de Hory claimed he was left with no other choice. He used a photograph of Modigliani and drew a self-portrait of the artist. He said he took it to Dalzell Hatfield Galleries. Hatfield feigned ambivalence and claimed that maybe his wife would like it. He brought the price down to $200. Several months later, though, de Hory picked up a newspaper that described the discovery of a masterpiece self-portrait by Modigliani. Hatfield had apparently sold it to James Alstorff, a high-profile Chicago dealer and Modigliani collector. De Hory phoned a dealer he knew in Chicago and asked him how much it had sold for. $4,000, he told de Hory. Livid at the pittance he had received and the fortune made by the dealers at his expense, he decided he had had enough. De Hory said, "My curiosity for the bohemian life in America is quite satisfied." De Hory went to Florida. He was perhaps exhausted by the constant travel, tired of selling his con in person and then moving on once he'd hit too many galleries. He decided to send letters. He would describe the piece and send a photograph, then send the painting or drawing itself. "Dear Sir, I am in possession of a Matisse drawing, pen and ink, from period 1920 to 1925, representing a woman seated at a table with a bouquet of flowers, and for personal reasons, I would like to dispose of it. If you would be interested, I will gladly send you a photograph." He spent his mornings locked in his room, painting and studying books. By noon, finished with work, he would go to the beach. Galleries would sometimes hold on to the pieces for 5 or 6 weeks. If selling a con is difficult in person, it was infinitely harder by post. He couldn't charm the buyer or spin tales of his grand aristocratic lifestyle and impressive family art collection. He couldn't react to wide eyes of amazement or reassure furrowed brows of skepticism. His attempts to invent provenance were getting lazy and unimaginative. He would tell the galleries simply that the pieces had been acquired by his family some years ago. He claimed that over the next 2 years, he sold this way to museums and galleries in New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago, Seattle, Baltimore, Washington, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Dallas, and San Francisco. Matisse had recently died, and the value of his work increased, and so de Hory began to churn out fake Matisses. He sold one of them to the Fogg Museum at Harvard University. Years later, Emily Ra was co-curating an exhibition of 20th century master drawings at the Fogg. It would include drawings by Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, and Salvador Dalí. Ra was reaching out to dealers, she told me, searching for pieces to include, when she spoke to one dealer who had a Picasso she desperately wanted in the exhibition. The dealer, Richard Sisson, agreed to loan the Picasso and also offered her a Matisse. "I have a really superb Matisse, and it's not a fake," he said. Ra told him the Fogg already had a drawing by Matisse from a similar period. It was a simple and beautiful piece, showing a woman with her chin propped on her hand, pomegranates scattered in front of her and surrounded by flowers. "Beware," Sisson said. "There are a lot of forgeries, and if it came from Raynal, it's no good." When Ra returned to her office, she took out the drawing. Sure enough, the records said that the drawing had been sold to the Fogg by a dealer named E. Raynal in 1955. The letterhead showed a Miami Beach address, and the price they had paid was suspiciously low. Ra showed it to her boss, Agnes Mongan, who had acquired the drawing. She thought it was good, a real Matisse. So did the Harvard professor of 20th century art, Frederick Decknatel. But Sisson had warned Ra, so she wrote a letter to Pierre Matisse, a dealer in New York and Henri Matisse's son. She enclosed a photo of the drawing, and his answer came back. It was real. Ra told him that it had come from a dealer named Raynal. Pierre Matisse responded, "Well, then it's a fake." All these experts had been fooled. It was worrying. Unable to shake off the bad feeling, Ra began investigating this dealer, Raynal, who was, of course, de Hory. She collected photographs of Matisse drawings from a book that Matisse had personally overseen in the mid-40s. Then she contacted galleries and museums across the country and asked whether they had any Matisse drawings from a man named Raynal. His fakes, it turned out, were everywhere. Some dealers had learned to steer clear of anything from Raynal, but many museums didn't know they were buying fakes. Raynal, she realized, had based many of his forgeries on a well-known Matisse painting that had been lauded as a masterpiece by the founding director of the MoMA. Raynal had used the recognizable subject. Then, after Ra had collected photographs of Raynal's fakes and placed them beside photos of real Matisse drawings, she said, "I could tell the difference." To this day, the FOG still has its Elmyr de Hory Matisse, which they use for teaching, to show students how to recognize the difference between a fake and the real thing. Joseph Faulkner had also received a letter from Elmyr Raynal. He thought it was odd that a dealer was writing to him from Miami Beach. He owned Main Street Galleries in Chicago and asked around at the Art Institute of Chicago about Elmyr Raynal. A curator of drawing told Faulkner that Raynal had sold to the museum and could be trusted. "The Institute told me they have no record of a sale from Raynal or de Hory." According to de Hory, Faulkner bought some drawings and paintings, and he continued to buy from de Hory, even once visiting him in Miami. Faulkner took some paintings back to Chicago to review before buying them, which he then sent to the Art Institute of Chicago for a second opinion. De Hory celebrated by purchasing a convertible Cadillac. Meanwhile, Faulkner was about to suffer a horrible embarrassment. The Art Institute thought the works were genuine, and Faulkner sent them on to a New York gallery for an exhibition. The gallery, however, suspected they were fake and sent a photo of a Matisse painting to Matisse's daughter in France. They wanted to confirm its authenticity. She wrote back. The answer was a resounding no. Faulkner swiftly reimbursed his clients and called de Hory in Florida, demanding documents that showed the provenance. In a panic, de Hory left Florida and Faulkner reported him to the authorities. On the run, de Hory claimed he went to Georgia, Arkansas, and California. He fled to Mexico for a while. Even there, he couldn't sell his fakes. Apparently, one dealer looking over a de Hory fake telephoned dealers in the US for an opinion. They said that the piece sounded like forgeries circulating in New York and Chicago. De Hory made his way to Canada and eventually decided to come back to the US. He took a taxi from the Canadian border to Detroit. Nervous about the crossing and not knowing what to say, he told the driver to take him to the art museum in the city. De Hory said he walked around the museum in a daze and then, turning a corner, came face to face with one of his own Matisses. He took it as a sign of welcome. Around this time, de Hory found his fakes turning up all over the place. He was seeing the impact of his years of selling forgeries. He saw 3 pieces he said were his included in a book by Arthur Fansteel about Modigliani. In the 1958 issue of Art News Annual, the Knoedler Gallery advertised a Matisse that de Hory had painted. When he saw that, de Hory phoned the gallery and demanded to know how much it was selling for. They told him it had already been sold, but they were soon getting a similar, although less impressive piece. How much would that one be? $60,000. De Hory was furious. He had sold it for a fraction of the price. De Hory took this as a personal affront. To make his frustration worse, he found it harder and harder to sell any of his own fakes. Word had spread around the galleries, and many dealers were on the lookout, forcing de Hory to bring his prices down to ever more irresistibly low levels. This made the inevitable markups ever more bitter. He went to Washington, D.C., and tried selling under a different name, but it still didn't work. Word reached Joseph Faulkner in Chicago, and after that, no galleries would touch him. De Hory knew the authorities were on his tail, and the dealers were watching out for a Hungarian art dealer. He had turned to forgery because he couldn't sell his own work. Now, he couldn't sell the forgeries either. He needed help, a partner. Then, he met a man who would offer him that solution. If only Elmyr de Hory could have stopped at this point for good. If he had decided then that he had gone as far as he could and stopped making forgeries, you might not be hearing about him now. His name would not have been printed in newspapers around the world, the art market might look a little different, and his entire life would have taken a completely different course. He could have gotten away with the whole thing. Meeting Fernand Legros seemed to offer de Hory a lifeline, but it would end up being the most devastating mistake of his life. Two, the Prado on the Prairie. Al Gore Meadows picked up the phone in his office in Dallas, Texas. It was April 1964. Two French art dealers, his wife Betty told him, had turned up on the doorstep looking for him. A friend of hers had asked the two men to show Meadows some paintings. "They want to come at 4 o'clock, Betty said. "Can you come home early?" He didn't leave. But when he drove home that evening, he found them waiting in the driveway, the canvases unloaded from the trunk, propped against their car. Al Gore Meadows was a no-nonsense, kindly fellow who had made millions in the oil business. He had grown up poor, the son of the town doctor in rural Georgia, and went on to found the General American Oil Company, which became one of the country's biggest oil producers. Round-faced, with a square jaw, he was the straight-backed sort of businessman who never fired anyone, or let a bad word be said about a single employee. When, in the 50s, he drilled for oil in Spain, he visited Madrid. Every day he went to the Prado Museum and became enamored by the art. He fell in love with the Spanish masters like El Greco and Diego Velázquez. He recalled, "I thought it would give a certain elegance to the home, a few old masters." A friend told Time magazine, "Al operated on the same code in buying art as he did in oil. A man's word and handshake were good enough." And based on this system, Meadows said, he had never made a bad deal. He had no background in art, but his bank account was big enough that it didn't matter. He sought the services of a restorer who had worked at the Prado, a man with the improbable name Geronimo Seis Dedos, literally Geronimo, 6 fingers. Meadows' fortune put him in a unique position to buy up a considerable collection, and each time he went to Madrid, he stayed longer. He brought his family. They chose to take a room at the Ritz Hotel, barely a 5-minute walk from the museum. A dream took hold of him. Meadows wanted to collect not just for his own home, but to one day have enough for a museum in Texas. It would be like the Prado, where the masters of Spain and France and the rest of Europe could be seen. By 1962, he had amassed one of the most important collections of Spanish art and donated it to the Southern Methodist University. He provided them with a $1 million endowment, along with enough money to construct a museum, his own little Prado in Texas. He named it the Virginia Meadows Museum, after his first wife, who died just before the donation announcement. But it would become known as the Prado on the Prairie. The two men outside Meadows' mansion, waiting by their car, had heard all about the millionaire collector in Texas. Fernand Legros and his companion Réal Lassard introduced themselves as dealers from Paris. Meadows would recall, "Being a gentleman, I wasn't going to order them off the place." He invited them in. They were, he thought, unappealing, a bit desperate. Meadows looked over their paintings and bought 5 for $50,000. He probably thought he'd never hear from them again. But they turned up 2 months later. And then again 4 months after that. And then again 3 months after. Again and again it continued like this. Each time they tried to sell Meadows more pieces, and each time they irritated him more. He tired of their clawing insistence, but he liked the art, and he would buy a few pieces. Not, however, without having a little fun with them first. Meadows said, I'd always let them hang around for 8 or 10 days when I knew they were spending some $200 a day in Dallas. Just when they were about to leave town, I'd offer them half of what they originally asked. Exasperated but desperate, they would accept. Over the course of about 3 years, Legros and Lassard sold Meadows over 60 paintings and drawings, as well as a watch and diamond ring. The whole time, Meadows thought he was turning one over on them, chuckling at the joke he'd played. What he didn't know was that Legros and Lassard were the ones playing a game on Meadows, laughing at a joke with a devastating punchline. This was a reality that would become devastatingly clear. When Elmyr de Hory first met Fernand Legros, he also hated him. A friend had brought Legros to one of de Hory's parties in New York. Legros, de Hory recalled, hadn't shaved in at least 2 or 3 days. He had a long, narrow nose, thin black hair, a suit and shirt that wasn't just not soigné, but looked like he'd slept in it for 3 days on Washington Square. He looked like a Bowery bum, and I gave him my usual stare that I reserve for such types. But when the two met again years later, at a time when de Hory was unable to show his face at most galleries, the two struck up a partnership. Their accounts differ as to how they met, but de Hory claims they were forced to live together at the home of their mutual friend. De Hory was recovering from hospitalization, and Legros was homeless. He found Legros's ignorance about art infuriating, but after some time appreciated having a student. They realized that they could help one another. De Hory needed a way to sell his forgeries. Legros was more than happy to take the risk. They went to Miami, and de Hory dressed Legros in his suits and sent him out with several fakes under his arm. De Hory told Legros how to act and what to say. He had gone from selling his con in person to selling his con by mail to now selling his con through a substitute. The potential for disaster was huge. They split the sales 60-40, the majority going to de Hory. Legros made him nervous, and de Hory grew suspicious that Legros was playing down the sales in order to keep more of the profit. Around this time, de Hory met a young French-Canadian on the beach, Réal Lassard. De Hory liked his sweet and simple nature, and again was glad to have a student. Legros liked Lassard, and the three struck up a trio partnership. De Hory was the painter, Legros the seller, and Lassard would be Legros's personal secretary. The arrangement worked well for de Hory. He was glad to be far away from the crime. But when de Hory and Legros returned from a trip to Chicago, Legros told them that 2 men from the FBI had come looking for someone named Raynal. They had described de Hory perfectly. The 3 of them fled. They said they traveled around Texas, Missouri, and Colorado, before ending in California. De Hory continued to suspect Legros was lying about the sales. Once, de Hory ventured out to sell one piece by himself, and when Legros found out, he flew into a rage. He screamed at de Hory, demanding a cut. By 1959, de Hory decided once again he had had enough. Selling had become too difficult. The authorities were catching up with him, those in Chicago were closing in, and he realized that he couldn't outrun them forever. By December, according to Interpol, Elmyr Raynal would be charged in Chicago with the selling of fake paintings. And there was Legros. There were too many problems. He was too volatile, and their partnership had quickly become untenable. De Hory decided to leave, so he went to Canada, where Legros had procured a passport. It had presumably been bought or stolen from a man named Joseph Boutin. De Hory put his own photograph in the passport and left. After more than a decade away, de Hory found himself back in Europe. In Paris and Rome, he tried again to sell his own work, hoping this new start and new name could bring him some success. Eventually, he settled on the island of Ibiza, in Spain. But according to de Hory, Legros was never far off. When Legros caught up with him, he came armed with a compelling offer. De Hory could stay on the island, settle down, and Legros would travel around Europe and the US selling the fakes. De Hory would no longer have to move from town to town and would never have to worry about the hustle ever again. He could be far away from the crime in another country entirely. Legros would shoulder the risk, while De Hory could live in comfort and paint. De Hory agreed. As a safeguard against further disputes over percentages and profits, Legros gave De Hory a monthly salary with the occasional bonus. De Hory instructed Legros that he had to make sure the paintings had enough time to dry before selling them. Legros said he would. Legros sought ever more creative ways to get higher prices for the paintings. He would visit the widows of painters and convince them to sign letters of authentication. He apparently visited an elderly Kees van Dongen, whose eyesight was so poor he authenticated one of the forgeries himself and reminisced about the model who had posed for him. Legros would take catalogues and remove the photos, replacing them with photos he had taken of De Hory's work. Few things carry as much authority as a book. In fact, Legros even had a scheme by which he put pieces up for auction, and if the piece didn't sell, Legros would buy it back. But, since the auction house had printed a catalogue with the fake included, Legros now had a document to give his story authority, and he could sell the work for a much higher price. Legros sold all over Paris, New York, Chicago, and Switzerland, and then broadened out to Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Tokyo. In Paris, he organized a show of Raoul Dufy works, almost all of which were by De Hory. In the US, Legros was no more cautious. The market was booming, the economy was doing well, and the rich were buying art like never before. Many wealthy people new to the art world were pouring money into the market. They were rich and clueless. They made the perfect mark. That's when Legros heard about a kindly oilman who had collected enough Spanish masters to build himself a little Prado museum in Texas. Algor Meadows met Legros and Lessard on an afternoon in April 1964. His irritation turned into reserved interest. Meadows later said, "I thought they were quite knowledgeable. They would always show you the paintings and the certificates. We weren't dealing with a couple of dumb bunnies, I'll tell you." One day in 1966, Meadows was showing his collection to Donald Vogel. A Texan gallery owner, Vogel was looking at one of the paintings when Meadows told him it was a Picasso. In his memoir, Vogel recalled saying, "If that's a Picasso, I'll eat it." Meadows dismissed him and showed him a Maurice Utrillo painting. Vogel said, "No way." When Meadows showed him some works by Modigliani, Vogel was at a loss. "How can I explain it to you?" Vogel said. "It's wrong. My gut tells me so. It feels like two separate paintings have been put together." But Meadows wouldn't listen. He was proud of his collection. And when Vogel pointed out another bad Modigliani, Meadows said, "Ah, I got you. I have a catalogue with this on the cover," and rushed over to the bookshelf. It was still wrong, Vogel told him. The catalogue may be nice, but it didn't change the painting. Vogel couldn't understand how Meadows, a man who had been so successful in the oil business, could be so naive. Meadows told Vogel he wanted to sell some of his paintings and wanted Vogel to help him. Vogel waited as Meadows pulled 6 paintings from a hallway closet. These too, Vogel thought, were fake. But he didn't say anything and agreed to look them over. Meadows also gave Vogel a copy of the appraisal of his collection, accompanied by photographs of the paintings Vogel had questioned. Maybe he was stubborn in his need to settle a point, or maybe Vogel's words had gotten to him. But Meadows asked Vogel to check them out. Vogel agreed and took the appraisal home. As he read through it, he couldn't quite believe what he saw. It didn't make sense. It all looked wrong. What had happened, it turned out, was this. A few months earlier, Meadows had decided to get his collection appraised. A dealer from a prestigious and well-regarded New York auction house agreed to come to Dallas to do the appraisal. But something came up, causing him to delay. After 2 weeks, he told Meadows he needed to postpone yet again. When a frustrated Meadows hung up the phone, it just so happened that Fernand Legros was waiting for him in his office, in town once more, hoping to sell some paintings. Having overheard the conversation, Legros recommended someone he knew, Carol Hogan. Maybe he could do the appraisal. It is perhaps unnecessary to highlight how careless it was to turn to Legros for advice on authenticating the pieces that Legros himself had sold. But remember, Meadows believed Legros to be the real thing, an expert in his field. Hogan came to Meadows' house in August and by September sent an appraisal. The collection was worth $1,362,750. Meadows was delighted since, as he put it, this was considerably in excess of what I had paid for the paintings. He continued, with the Hogan report, I felt absolutely certain that every painting in the collection was authentic. And with this happy outcome, he had turned to the prospect of selling and making himself a handsome profit. That's when Meadows invited Vogel to his home and handed him the Hogan appraisal. Vogel looked it over and couldn't understand it. Hogan must have known these paintings were wrong, he thought. Vogel showed the photos to some colleagues at the ADAA, the Art Dealers Association of America. He first showed them to Klaus Perls, a co-founder of the association and the very first person Elmyr de Hory had sold a forgery to in New York. Since buying those 2 fake Picassos from de Hory in 1948, Klaus Perls had heard over and over news of the Hungarian art dealer peddling fakes. Perls agreed that many in the collection looked wrong as he flipped through the black and white photos. They were both alarmed by the number of fakes Meadows seemed to have. Klaus Perls had co-founded the Art Dealers Association of America in 1962 because throughout the 50s he had grown concerned. The art market had been expanding and more people were entering it without knowing how to navigate it. The art market had become a Wild West free-for-all, unbound and unruly. People sold what they liked when they liked, and as the market grew, it had opened to the careless as well as the unscrupulous. By the late 50s, it had become a mess. There was an increasing number of fakes, not least of all by one particularly pesky Hungarian forger. Often when fakes were identified, they would be sold on and continue to circulate. Dealers too took advantage of the inexperienced buyers and sold bad quality work or forgeries for high prices. Authentication is frustratingly inexact. It's not science, it's barely an art. Dealers develop years of experience, often specializing in a particular artist or period. Then it comes down to a first look and a gut feeling. Perls once said, "It's the summing up of all the knowledge you've acquired, all the things you've seen of the artist, all you've read." Perls likened it, in his words, to getting a letter from your mother. When you see her handwriting on the top, you don't have to open it to tell who it's from. Like forged signatures or faked handwriting, lines that are normally dashed off quickly and without thought suddenly look deliberate and anguished, recognizable only to those with intimate familiarity. Kenneth Wayne, the director of the Modigliani project, for example, said that he can recognize a de Hory fake from, for instance, the stiffness in the line. Wayne told me that Modigliani's brushstrokes were sinuous and deliberate, while de Hory's were not. De Hory's subjects have beady little eyes, he said. Modigliani's eyes weren't as creepy. Wayne looks at the elements of painting that may be rushed or overlooked, places where the personality of the forger might come through. He describes de Hory's rendering of hands in Modigliani paintings as rushed and graceless. And he notes that de Hory would often paint the women's hair with goofy bangs, something he knows as an expert Modigliani didn't do. "Bangs here, bangs there," said Wayne. Modigliani was more sophisticated. So, in 1962, Perls co-founded the association to give a structure to expertise in the art world. It would be a network of dealers who were invited based on their specialties. Then, if anyone needed an opinion, the association provided an option by which they could seek the best experts' advice. They set up the association, and it still continues today. It turned the free-for-all into something formalized, giving the opinion of experts weight over those with only a shallow understanding. It was also meant as an educational tool to put new and inexperienced collectors on the right path. So, looking over the photos of Meadows' paintings and reading the odd appraisal, Pearls consulted Ralph Collin, the executive vice president of the ADAA. He agreed they should take a look at the collection in person. So Vogel telephoned Meadows and asked if some members from the association could come to Dallas and take a look. Meadows said he would be happy to have them and wrote a letter inviting them. Since several association members would be in town for the opening of a Picasso exhibition at the Dallas Museum of Fine Art in early February, they agreed to the 6th. Meadows had no idea what he'd just signed up for. Likely, in his mind, it was something informal, a chance to get a second opinion here and there. He was happy with the story Hogan's appraisal told him, and it probably had not occurred to him that now a group of the nation's leading art experts, concerned and doubtful of his collection's authenticity, were about to descend on his mansion and interrogate every one of his works. It was 2:50 p.m., wrote Meadows in a memo, on February 6, 1967. When they arrived at his home, Meadows opened the door, and Vogel introduced the panel of assembled experts. There was Stephen Hahn, a dealer who specialized in 20th century French art, Daniel and Eleanor Seidenberg, who were considered to be the top authorities on Picasso, Klaus Pearls, and Frank Pearls, Klaus's brother, who had a gallery in LA. Klaus Pearls was in a hurry. He wanted to get straight to it. They filed in, and the first painting Pearls saw was a huge, fake Vlaminck. He then noticed a Picasso that also looked wrong. Pearls turned to Meadows and said, "Do you want to know the truth?" Meadows recalled, "They were so brutal. All this fake, good, fake. Vogel explained that Daniel Seidenberg was the top expert on Picasso. Seidenberg looked at one painting and said simply, "No way." They turned to a Trillo. Pearl said, "A Trillo never painted a tree like that." Vogel recalled, "When I examined the Bernard closely, it just disintegrated before my eyes. The colors were not right. The texture was not right." Meadows didn't believe it. He explained that he had all the right certificates and documents, but it didn't make a difference. He said later, "They walked through the house very quickly, turning to the right and to the left, looking at the paintings for no longer than a minute." He didn't understand how they could be so certain. When the group arrived at another Picasso, something caught Klaus Pearls' eye. He looked ahead at the next few paintings, and it hit him. Pearls, normally soft-spoken, cried out, "Elmyr de Hory painted these! Good God! I remember when I helped that! This should be the beginning of the end for him." Pearls turned to Meadows and said, "Mr. Meadows, you can buy all the fakes you want, but don't dare sell them once you are put on notice that they are bad." With this, Meadows erupted into a rage. He shouted at Pearls, "Nobody tells me what the hell to do. I do what I want to do in business." "That's all right," said Pearls, "but you're on notice." Seidenberg said later he regretted that they had not been more gentle with Meadows. As the group left, Meadows pulled Vogel aside. He didn't want any written report about this, nothing in writing. Taken aback, Vogel said there wasn't anything he could do. The wheels were in motion. This is what the association did, and Meadows had agreed to their evaluation. Meadows shrugged off the entire thing. He believed they had come in with their minds made up about Legros and Lessard. They had ignored Hogan's report and all the certificates Meadows had shown them. To Meadows, the paintings were real, undeniably real, and nothing a panel of the nation's leading experts could say would change that. After they left, Meadows telephoned Vogel and reiterated his plea. Nothing in writing. Vogel and several others from the association worried that Meadows planned to keep the whole thing secret. it would be dangerous for him to sell all these fakes as real. So on February 15th, Ralph Collin wrote a letter to Meadows. It said, "We regret to inform you that of the 58 items included in the Hogan appraisal, which were viewed by our members, it is our members' opinion that 11 of them are or may be by the artists to whom they are attributed." Collin put in no uncertain terms, 44 of Meadows' paintings were fake. Several others were misattributed. Meadows' collection had been worth more than $1.3 million, and others later said it might have been worth as much as $3 million. He had built his Prado in Texas, but in an instant his private collection was rendered almost worthless. Meadows was unhappy with what he had heard, so he did what the stubborn do. He found someone who would agree with him. He consulted a dealer who Vogel considered disreputable. The dealer told Meadows he thought the collection was fine, but clearly the experience with the group from the association kept scratching away in the back of Meadows' mind. As Vogel put it, Meadows learned the painful truth that there is no bargain in art if it's not good art. Meadows sent a telegram to Legros saying he had a week to agree to buy his paintings back. When no response came, he decided to ship the collection to French authorities in Paris to be reviewed by a judicial board of experts, setting in motion events that would lead to an international arrest warrant. A short time after Meadows' humiliation, several small scandals broke in France. Legros and Lassard had put a few paintings up for sale at an auction house in Pontoise, just outside Paris. A flamenco was being readied for display. According to one account, as a careful attendant wiped away some dust, the paint smeared on the cloth. The 60-year-old painting was still drying. According to another account, an André Durand expert saw the catalogue from Pontoise and called the police, telling them the image on the cover was a fraud. Then, a dealer in Paris took an Albert Marquet painting he had been offered by Legros and showed it to the artist's widow. Ms. Marquet declared it a fake and also called the police. These were linked back to Legros. Lassard had been arrested in January. Then the newspapers found out about the Meadows forgeries. Pearls and Vogel, worried what Meadows might do, spoke to the press and the story got out. The papers referred to the mysterious Monsieur X. But after several months, the French police issued an international arrest warrant for Fernand Legros. These various scandals were traced back to Elmyr de Hory, forger of paintings, known resident of the island of Ibiza. The Spanish authorities arrested him. Three. The Master Forger. In the Spanish November sunshine, Mark Forhey stepped from the boat onto the dock and became aware that someone was watching him. The 20-year-old was on a break from his second year at college. He was tall and slim, with a flop of blonde hair parted to the side. Back home in Minnesota, his father wanted him to be drafted for Vietnam. "Just sign up and get it over with," he'd told Forhey. He didn't, and instead, in 1969, went backpacking around Europe. Forhey wanted to explore the art museums and get away from Minnesota. He met an Englishman in Spain while the two were hitchhiking to Barcelona. The Englishman, also named Mark, suggested Forhey come with him to a small island off the Spanish coast called Ibiza. Forhey had planned to continue south through Spain onto Morocco. As Forhey describes it, the English Mark said, "Why don't you come to Ibiza with me? It's a beautiful place. A lot of times people come just to stay." Retelling it, Forhey chortled at the suggestion and told me, "So I went with him, and it was one of those remarkable things. I don't know what it is, the celestial trajectory of things that take your life on a sudden right angle." Forhey would stay on that little island for 7 years, which would change his life entirely. Back then, Ibiza was a small, sleepy village dreaming of being a town. Cut off from the rest of Spain, which was under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, the island of Ibiza was a hideaway, a haven of weirdness from the ultra-conservative mainland. There was a strange mixture of young hippies dropping out on the beach and aristocrats holidaying in the sun. When the two Marks got off the boat, Hory saw a man watching the new arrivals. He was an older man with a friendly elfin face and carefully combed hair, dressed smartly in a cashmere sweater and a folded cravat nestled in his open collar. Hory approached him and asked if he spoke English. "Like they do in Kansas City," the man declared through a thick Hungarian accent. Hory thought there's a little bit of a lilt in his voice that indicated he was probably not Midwestern. Missourian or not, Hory asked him where they could find a cheap place to stay. The man gestured down some narrow cobbled streets. Later that evening, Hory was wandering around the portside bars and saw the old man again. The man asked, "Did you have any luck finding a place?" Hory told him they hadn't. They figured they would probably sleep on the beach. The older man said he had a guest room and they were welcome to stay a few nights. He introduced himself. Elmyr de Hory. The house was on a hill overlooking the old city. In the mornings, Hory's host was nowhere to be seen, appearing only at lunch. Hory admired de Hory's elegance, his beautiful silverware, his library of art books, and his aristocratic background. The man, it turned out, was a Hungarian baron. When the English Mark left to meet up with his family on the island, de Hory invited Mark Hory to stay on. He needed someone to help around the house, clean the pool, assist with his parties, and act as secretary for his correspondence. Hory could stay with a small salary and become a live-in assistant. He agreed. De Hory dictated letters. Many were to an author who had written a book about his life. Why someone would write a book about his host, Hory didn't know. But he jotted down de Hory's messages, mainly disagreements over royalties. About 3 weeks into his stay, a copy of the book arrived at the house. A biography by Clifford Irving, an American novelist who lived on the island. The book had an odd title, Fake, the story of Elmyr de Hory, the greatest art forger of our time. Hory couldn't quite believe it. He began reading. He read about de Hory's adventures in the US, his first forgery for Klaus pearls, his bad luck in Florida, and his troubles with Fernand Legros. Hory was enthralled by the rebelliousness of it. He recalled, "When I found out that Elmyr had tweaked the nose of the establishment, I thought that was very cool, and I applauded him for that." Hory wanted to know more. Who was Elmyr? The answer to that question was about to transform in front of his eyes. By 1968, Real Assad was in jail, and Fernand Legros was a wanted man. The two of them had implicated de Hory, and the Spanish authorities snatched him up. Luckily for de Hory, they didn't have much to go on, and the French and Spanish governments did not at the time have an extradition agreement. So the Spanish authorities, not wanting to leave empty-handed, accused de Hory of the rather arcane crime of associating with vagrants and undesirables. De Hory's friends were brought in as character witnesses. The Princess Smilia Mikhailovich was questioned. A socialite who regularly attended de Hory's soirees, she was, by the way, a princess entirely by self-appointment. Was de Hory a homosexual, she was asked? As de Hory later told Mark Hory, Princess Mikhailovich's response was, "Oh yes, but so was Julius Caesar, and Michelangelo, and Leonardo. They were all homosexual too." Homosexuality was a crime in Franco's ultra-conservative Spain. De Hory spent 2 months in jail and was banished from Ibiza for a year. But prison in Ibiza was far from the harrowing experience de Hory might have feared. During his 2-month stay, he said he lounged in a deck chair in the sun-filled courtyard. He had plenty of visitors, as many as 14 people a day, he claimed. He was permitted comforts like food parcels, toiletries, his phonograph for playing records, and even, apparently, his own bed from home. When de Hory was released and returned to the island, he had transformed into a local celebrity. Then reporters showed up. Clifford Irving, the American novelist living on the island, acquired de Hory's life rights and wrote an article for Look magazine. It featured large photo spreads of de Hory's forgeries. Irving described the figure of a genius forger who had turned the art world on its head, traipsing around the US, filling galleries with fakes and leaving in his wake a tangle of befuddled dealers. Then Irving wrote de Hory's biography, and in 1969 it arrived at the house. It was not long before Elmyr de Hory became known the world over as the greatest art forger of all time. But de Hory was nervous about his new fame. Ever glad to be the centre of so much attention, he was reluctant to talk about his crimes. This Hungarian aristocrat had fallen from grace and was unsure how to pick up the pieces. As Mark Fahey describes it, he was still trying to find his sea legs in the aftermath of the scandal, trying to orient himself, trying to find out where he belonged. An art dealer reached out to de Hory. Francois Reichenbach had bought several forgeries from de Hory, but he had become a documentary filmmaker. And when he discovered that his collection was now worthless, he approached de Hory not with outrage, but with the suggestion that he make a documentary about him. Seeing an opportunity to rearrange the pieces of his life in a way that he liked, de Hory agreed. And soon, members of the film crew were busying themselves lighting up his living room and setting up the scene. Reichenbach pointed the camera at de Hory and asked how his life as a forger began. It was Paris, he said, in April 1946. A titled English woman walked in one day to my room, and she saw pinned on the wall a drawing. She said, "Hey, why you got that Picasso?" I said, "Well, do you think it's a Picasso?" "Well, I know enough about Picasso to know when it's a Picasso or not." I say, "Fine." She said, "Would you sell it?" I say, "Delighted." He's hesitant, but theatrical. The English woman, he said, paid him £50. He felt bad about tricking a friend, but, as he told Reichenbach with a smile, "The £50 helped me out a great deal, because it was the day of the payment for the rent." With a hint of pleasure, de Hory added, "I would like to see the poor Hungarian refugee who would have resisted that temptation." Later, when he found out she had sold it for several times the amount she'd paid, de Hory decided to do an experiment. He made a few drawings in the style of Picasso and sold them to a gallery on the left bank. It was a good story. Unfortunately, it's not likely to be a true one. But let's not let that get in the way. De Hory insisted to the crew that the true money was never made by him. He always earned very little, he said, while the riches were made by the dealers, the so-called experts who had labelled his work as authentic. They took his pieces, paid him little, and sold expensively. If anything, they were exploiting him. Was it really so bad, then, to make a modest sum from the mistake of an expert who should know better? De Hory said, "I do feel amused that I am able to fool once in a while somebody very pompous and somebody very pretentious. That I like." De Hory's cold discomfort begins to thaw in the warmth of the spotlight. He talks about his technique. He says, "Matisse's drawings, lines were never that sure as mine." As he speaks, he mimes the curves of a Matisse figure in the air. "He was hesitant when he made the drawing, you know. He added to it a little more and a little more. It wasn't as flowing, it wasn't as sure as mine. I had to hesitate to make it more Matisse-like." Was it possible, standing there, a small grin rising from the side of his mouth, de Hory was saying that he was a better painter, technically, than Matisse? Eventually, in one of the interviews, he stands hands on hips in the middle of his living room like a host entertaining his guests at a cocktail party. He is wearing an elaborate necklace over his shirt, and his face tilts back with a mischievous smile, his eyebrows arched in boyish feigned naivete. He says, "I would like to see any expert or any museum director or any art dealer who know which one is a Matisse and which one is by Elmyr." He takes a long, satisfied pause, leaning one hand against the fireplace, the other propped on his hip, taking it all in. "And I am ready to accept the challenge." De Hory strolls through the town, greeting everyone. "Tomorrow, it's a big party, so don't miss it," he says. People on the island had wondered who the mysterious Hungarian was. Who was Elmyr? a dealer, a painter, a noble baron from Budapest. The following evening, de Hory is dressed in a tuxedo, enjoying the flourish of his monocle held from time to time to his eye. He greets the guests as they arrive, making flowing gestures of delight, big European kisses on the cheek. As de Hory is playing host, Clifford Irving, his biographer, pulls him aside. At the time of filming, the two were not on speaking terms, but, for the sake of the documentary, put on a happy face. Beside the grey-haired de Hory with his bow tie and a red carnation tucked into his tuxedo lapel, Irving looks like a scruffy beatnik. He has long sideburns and is dressed in a dark turtleneck and a tan jacket. It's not just that Irving is younger. The two look like different eras colliding. Early 60s New York at an old-world European party, taking place in 1970. Irving says to de Hory, "I must tell you something. I went to the airport today and picked up a copy of the London Daily Express." De Hory lets out an ooh in an overemphasized moment of surprise. He looks up to the camera and then around at the guests. Irving continues, "There was an article, exposed, a man who holds the art world to ransom." Through his monocle, de Hory peers down at the paper, his eyebrows bouncing up in a pantomime of delighted shock, and then down into a perplexed frown. Irving continues, "Sitting in a sunny studio in a £60,000 villa on the Mediterranean island of Ibiza, it took Elmyr de Hory, the world's greatest art forger, just 1 hour to draw an original Modigliani." "It's a big article," de Hory says. He then repeats to himself the words, "holds the art world to ransom." He takes the newspaper and goes around the party showing it to the guests, chewing the words over and over, "holds the art world to ransom." He reads out the sentence, "Certainly Elmyr is a profound embarrassment to them all." He chuckles, repeats the sentence again in English, in French. He looks proud. He wasn't a lowly criminal. He was a mastermind. He'd made fools of the art world. An elite that had tried once upon a time to make a fool out of him. This was a story de Hory could get behind. For the camera, he paints a Matisse and a Picasso, and then, when they're finished, places them into a fire. Goodbye, Matisse. The young American, Mark Fahey, was swept along in the excitement of de Hory's new fame. He said, "The pace picked up furiously. Everybody wanted to be around Elmyr de Hory, the genius art forger. Whenever de Hory had money, he spent it on parties. Every day, guests streamed in and out of the house. People who lived on the island at the time called de Hory the soul of Ibiza. His parties were always sprinkled with aristocrats, socialites, and glamorous celebrities. De Hory's party guests, said Fahey, had to fall into one of 3 distinct categories. They had to be either young and attractive, or they could be interesting. A writer or painter, for instance, in which case they need not be young or attractive. Or they could be titled royalty, in which case they need not be young, attractive, or interesting. Fahey said, "I always thought, for reasons not quite clear to me, that for artists, art was supposed to be their raison d'etre. But I discovered that that wasn't the case for Elmyr. Art was his craft and his profession, and it allowed him to make a living. But where his heart really was, his true passion, it was people." The actress Ursula Andress was a staple of de Hory's dinner parties. Fahey once met Brigitte Bardot. She was talking to de Hory when she glanced over to the young Fahey and commented, "Who's the beautiful boy?" loud enough to leave him speechless. The old art forger enjoyed Fahey's company. He guided the Minnesotan through the world of high society, teaching him how to dress and behave. Fahey said he could not help but feel like he was in My Fair Lady, playing Eliza Doolittle to Elmyra's Henry Higgins. When he met the Countess de Chabrol, Fahey mentioned his sister was in Detroit. The Countess asked if he knew the Fords. When the word Minnesota provoked a blank stare from the European aristocracy, he would offer trivia. Minnesotans own more reindeer per capita than any other state. When it came time for Fahey to meet Princess Mikhailovich, De Hory taught him the correct way to kiss the hand of royalty. Bend from the waist and pretend to kiss. For he wrote in his memoir, "No puckering or drooling, just swoop in like a bat going for a mosquito." De Hory told Faughey to practice on him. Although the gesture was, of course, all theatre, as De Hory knew the princess's aspiration to royalty was fiction. They were playing a role in a story she was telling about herself. De Hory brought the young Faughey into a world far from his working-class background. He had been thrust into a life of glamour and excitement, where he met countesses and dukes and learned to exist in the world of princesses. De Hory would tell him about his upbringing as a Hungarian baron in Budapest. One day, a canvas arrived from home, and De Hory unrolled it. It was a painting by Philip de Laszlo, De Hory said, as he inspected the cracks in the paint and damage from its years rolled up in storage. It showed two young boys in sailor suits. De Hory placed it on a stretcher, and Faughey recognized the younger of the two boys as De Hory, his little elfin face and mischievous eyes, at about 5 years old. De Hory began touching it up, repairing the paint. He used techniques he had learned as a restorer. De Laszlo was a Hungarian painter who was well known for doing portraits of the aristocracy and royalty. He painted Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, the Queens of Spain and Sweden, King Edward VII of England, and Pope Leo VIII. Because they were Hungarian aristocrats, De Hory said, De Laszlo had painted his family. This was one of the few relics of his life from before the war. He hung it up in the home where everyone could see it. De Hory often spoke about his upbringing. His Catholic father had been an ambassador to several countries. His Jewish mother had been a glamorous socialite. He recalled beautiful silverware and servants and horse-drawn carriages. His mother had been shot during the war by a Russian soldier who wanted her coat. His brother, he said, had died in a car racing accident in the 1930s. The rest of his family, De Hory said, had died in the Holocaust. With all the attention, documentaries, articles and books, De Hory hoped it would inspire interest in his own work. He believed that his celebrity as Elmyr the great art forger would naturally lead to what he wanted all along: interest in Elmyr the artist. "I want to paint my own paintings," he said irritably to Reichenbach. "I want to live on my own paintings. I want to rely uniquely and exclusively on my work. And I think my work is good enough and serious enough to give pleasure and joy to the people who will acquire them." Maybe now, finally, he could sell his own work that was pretending to be no one other than himself. He could be Elmyr de Hory the artist, not the forger. He had shown that he was as good as the greats like Picasso and Matisse. The best experts couldn't tell the difference. No one could deny that his work was just as beautiful, interesting, and enjoyable. He could finally take credit for his work and display his own name on it. But the interest never came. He was still a frustrated artist, striving. Mark Faughey said, "It was a crushing disappointment. He didn't foresee that at all." But people did come, interested in buying not his original work, but paintings in the style of the artists he forged. Instead of the work of an undiscovered talent, they wanted a souvenir from the infamous art forger. So he sold pastiches. His forgery days behind him, he painted in the manner of the greats he had imitated before. So that they couldn't be mistaken for forgeries, he used modern materials and signed his own name. He always opted for his first, Elmyr. For, he said, he was so trepidatious about his relationship with the law. He wouldn't have taken the risk, and he didn't need to, because there was a steady stream of people at his door willing to buy his works in the manner of, and then with his signature on the bottom. Now I know there have been some instances when that signature is effaced. Many art forgers have sold pastiches after their crimes were revealed, cashing in on their infamy. People buy pastiches for the same reason they buy anything else. They like the picture, they like the story. Who wouldn't want to own a piece of the infamy? To buy a part of de Hory's impact on the art world has a punk appeal. It's openly deceptive and exists in flagrant contempt of the rules. It becomes a symbol. But de Hory always wanted to be known as a painter in his own right. He hated being called a forger and always described what he had done as creating paintings that could pass as Picasso or Modigliani. He always elevated himself to their level. De Hory kept trying. He had several shows, in Spain, in London, but all of them ended up as exhibitions of his pastiches. Sometimes he would paint something in his own style, but when it was placed in the gallery, it would be labelled in the style of Cézanne, for example. They weren't interested in Elmyr de Hory. They only wanted Elmyr the forger. He couldn't outrun his own disguise. Mark Faughey saw how disappointing it was for him. De Hory enjoyed the openings, acting as master of ceremonies, but he was left frustrated. He always believed in himself as an artist. Sometimes, Faughey was invited into de Hory's studio. Typically, no one was allowed in. It was de Hory's private sanctuary, where he would spend his mornings. When de Hory needed someone to sit for him, Faughey would watch de Hory as he worked. It was a small room with a skylight, a rug under the easel, and canvases scattered around, some leaning facing the wall. De Hory would peer through his glasses, inhale, and hold his breath as he leaned forward towards the canvas, breathing only as he finished the brushstroke and stepped back. Faughey said that despite the constant flow of people, de Hory was lonely. De Hory would say, "Friendships are easy to make, hard to keep." In the young Faughey, he had found a dependable friend. De Hory hated to be alone. If Faughey was late for dinner, de Hory would become agitated and upset. So Faughey made sure to be punctual. Once, when they were in London on a trip, Faughey went out to see a girlfriend who was also in town. He returned to the hotel that evening to find de Hory had packed all of his bags. He was either on the trip with him or her. Faughey made sure that de Hory didn't feel alone for the rest of the trip. De Hory needed him. Faughey described their dynamic lovingly, as Stockholm Syndrome at a Swiss finishing school. As Faughey puts it, friendship for him was simultaneously his greatest sense of reward and his greatest sense of disappointment. He continued, he liked to say, "My friend, right or wrong." For Faughey, he had found a mentor and an adopted father in de Hory. He said, "In many ways, he was much more of a father to me than my own father. He showed a depth of concern and caring for my future that I never sensed to be present or forthcoming from my own family." Early on, de Hory enrolled the young American in French lessons because, he said, it would be unthinkable for him to live in Europe and speak less than 3 languages. He assigned Faughey readings, which included Fyodor Dostoevsky and James Baldwin, as well as a long list of art histories and artists' biographies. Faughey was told to study these books, and de Hory would test him. Over lunch, he might snap, "When did Botticelli live?" When Faughey correctly answered, 1445 to 1510, de Hory grinned and nicknamed him the art historian. Faughey had dropped out of college, but this was providing him with all the education he wanted. Faughey said, "He saw me as the proverbial blank canvas." When island fever made them restless, they travelled. In London, de Hory would help pick out clothes for Faughey. He told him, "People will always judge you by their first impression, so it's important you look your best." They travelled around Europe, visiting all the great museums. They went to Vienna, Venice, Florence, and Rome. Faughey recalled in his memoir, "In a condensed total immersion walking art history lecture, I felt my right brain would explode. The depth of his connoisseurship was staggering." De Hory talked and talked. His knowledge seemed endless. It was easy to forget he was wanted for forgery. But one morning on a trip to Geneva, in the fall of 1972, the two of them left their hotel room and the police were waiting in the lobby to arrest de Hory. Mark Faughey was questioned. Why were they in Geneva? Where had they been going that morning? He was let go, but de Hory was taken to jail. Elmyr de Hory had outrun arrests in several countries, always managing to escape a lifetime in prison. For he realized this could be the end. For the first time in years, he was alone. "For my next experiment, ladies and gentlemen," a deep voice purrs from the darkness, "I would appreciate the loan of any small personal object from your pocket, a key or a box of matches, a coin." "Ah, here it is, good sir," the voice says to a small boy holding up a key. "Hold it up 10 feet over your head, and watch out for the slightest hint of hanky-panky." The face of the man speaking emerges. Orson Welles, his huge frame draped in a dark cloak. He has a big, greying beard and puffs on a thick cigar. He takes the key and turns it before our eyes into a gold coin, before turning it back into a key for the delighted boy. So begins his film, about trickery and fraud, about lies. "As for the key," he says, "it was not symbolic of anything." Welles was something of a trickster in his own right. "I am a charlatan," he says. He had soared to international attention with his 1938 radio dramatization of War of the Worlds. Radio was in its infancy. CBS and NBC had begun broadcasting just over a decade earlier. Wells's radio play experimented with the form, and in his own dabbling with forgery, the show imitated breaking news radio bulletins. People tuning in thought they were listening to a special on dance music, a sweet waltz playing until it's interrupted by news of a flaming object like a meteorite crashing into a farm in New Jersey. Live on the scene with police sirens wailing and crowds screaming, the reporter cries out, "Good heavens! Something's wriggling out of the shadow like a grey snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. There, I can see the thing's body." Very soon, the country was under attack, an invasion by Martians. It sounds profoundly silly now, but the next day, newspapers reported widespread panic. The Washington Post reported that one man had had a heart attack while listening. Although in an appropriate tangle of forgery and myth-making, it turned out that the reports of panic were wildly over-exaggerated. But the myth never went away. As Welles put it, "I didn't go to jail. I went to Hollywood." He made Citizen Kane, considered to be one of the greatest movies of all time. He was only 24 years old at the time and spent the rest of his career in its shadow. Critics were cruel about every movie afterward, comparing it to Citizen Kane. Welles was dogged by accusations that the film had been written by someone else and that Welles had taken full credit. Taken, if you will, someone else's work and signed it with his own name. Those accusations were proved false much later, but it's continued to be the story people tell, even today. His entire career was spent struggling to get projects financed. Many were abandoned during production, others took years to complete. He was lauded with all the praise someone could hope for, but the most famous director in Hollywood found it so difficult to get funding that sometimes 2 shots in a single scene would be filmed years apart. And for the soldier's armor in his version of Othello, he had to fashion it out of sardine cans. Even when his films were completed, many only received praise long after his death, eventually accepted as classics. But at the time, critics weren't kind to Orson Welles. Then, Francois Reichenbach contacted Welles and told him there was a film he was making about an art forger. He wanted Welles to narrate it. The story of a faker proving expertise wrong and defying the gatekeepers of praise struck a chord. Welles didn't want to narrate the film. He wanted to make it. So he offered Reichenbach the role of producer if he would let Welles use the footage. Reichenbach accepted, and Orson Welles went to Ibiza. Welles filmed Elmyr de Hory all day and night. At one point, he noticed this young man never far from de Hory's side. Mark Forhey was in awe of the large, imposing figure, the legend of cinema. They noted they were both Midwesterners, and Welles decided to give Forhey something to say on camera. And in the movie, he appears, saying, "Several months ago, I read an article about Elmyr de Hory, and I was so impressed that I decided to come from Minnesota to Ibiza in the hope of meeting Elmyr. And now I have become his bodyguard. For he takes a pause every few words, looking nervous, perhaps struggling to remember his lines, because none of this was true. But, as Fawkey put it, when Orson Welles tells you to say something, you say it. Welles stayed one night and disappeared the next morning. He left a 3-page letter of thanks on his pillow. The film he made, F for Fake, is an experimental documentary and was the last major film he completed before he died. It blends many genres and intertwines stories about art, de Hory's biographer Clifford Irving, Howard Hughes, Pablo Picasso, and Wells's own career on the stage, in radio and in the movies. It ruminates on art, authorship, originality, and mortality. At the centre, holding all these narratives together, is Elmyr de Hory. The film looks modern even by today's standards. It's frenetic, playful, and bizarre. It is a predecessor to the personal essay film and the postmodern documentary. It would be bold even if it were made tomorrow. In all the surreal editing, Welles cuts Reichenbach's footage, putting himself in dialogue with the scenes. By the end, the kaleidoscope focuses on a story about Picasso and a woman's grandfather for long enough to make the viewer feel oriented, only to have the rug pulled out from under them. I did promise, Welles says, that for 1 hour I'd tell you only the truth. That hour, ladies and gentlemen, is over. For the past 17 minutes, I've been lying my head off. His own little piece of fake documentary. Orson Welles, the embodiment of the filmmaker as artistic genius, made a film based on recycled footage that admonishes the concept of originality and its worship. In doing so, he made a radically original, genre-breaking innovation of cinema. And he made Elmyr de Hory a star. Although the film was a commercial failure, it brought de Hory even greater international fame. The fan mail arrived in such volume the post office on the little island couldn't handle it and began complaining. De Hory was definitely not a criminal anymore. Who was Elmyr? He created a story in which he would be known as the great art forger who had fooled the art world. And everyone was repeating it. As the scandals in 1967 brought de Hory international fame, Fernand Legros watched. Rather than being ruined, his partner in crime de Hory had risen to the status of folk hero. De Hory had not met a disastrous end in a French jail, but had become a celebrity, an artistic rebel, and he was making money. All the while, Legros had been labelled a criminal. In the winter of 1967, an international warrant was issued for Legros' arrest. A few months later, according to newspapers at the time, a detective had overheard a suspicious conversation in Geneva. The police suspected it was Legros and found his hotel. He was staying in a room under a false name, so they hatched a plot straight out of a 1950s thriller. The police asked the bellboy to send a message saying that there was a phone call for Monsieur Legros. Then they would wait to see who picked it up and arrest him. An article from the newspaper Paris Match reads, "While the bellboy, accomplice in the plot, carried his notice board before the armchairs in the lobby, 2 policemen, disguised as clients, watched through a hole in a newspaper a strange little blonde powdered man who was in front of them and was registered under the name of MacDonald. Behind his dark glasses the man started, hesitated a second. Then he got up and went towards the telephone. There was the proof. The police lunged at him. In the struggle, Legros' wig and sunglasses were knocked to the floor, left behind as he was whisked away. For some reason, the Swiss authorities didn't hand him over to the French police, but instead kept him under house arrest at the Intercontinental Hotel. From his room for the next 5 years, he spun myths about himself. He told reporters that he was friends with Howard Hughes and Marilyn Monroe. He said that Sophia Loren had stayed with him in his luxurious prison hotel for 6 months of her pregnancy. He told his life story. He was born in Egypt, he said. a ballet dancer turned art dealer who had made his first $1 million in his 20s. He said he was made an honorary chieftain of Liberia and, according to the Des Moines Tribune, owned 13 automobiles, including 2 Rolls-Royces and a Lincoln Continental modelled after that of President Nixon, and always wore a solid gold belt. LeGros, his beard and thinning hair grown long, was always seen wearing a huge cowboy hat, large sunglasses, and a giant chain necklace over his various fur or snakeskin coats. One newspaper described LeGros as short and swarthy, a cross between El Topo and Roman Polanski, an image that was meant to be unflattering and has grown more so with age. Fahey would later opt for describing LeGros as Darth Vader meets Liberace. After the Clifford Irving book came out, LeGros was furious. Irving's biography of de Hory painted LeGros as an exploitative villain. LeGros sued Irving and the publishers of the biography for an astonishing $55 million. Irving tried to convince him to drop the case. He told LeGros he couldn't pay any damages. Irving knew LeGros was planning his own book and said in a letter, according to the New York Daily News, "Each book would help the sales of the other book, and we might get a real double success de scandale going for us." He also said he knew a producer who might do a film on LeGros. "This, I presume, is something you would enjoy. You could say any damned thing you please about what a canaille Elmyr is and what a liar I am. Why not? It would make good publicity for all of us." In his interviews, LeGros trash-talked de Hory, calling him a second-rate painter. Then, in the fall of 1972, he got word that de Hory was in Geneva, and he concocted a plan. He tried to entice de Hory into a trap by sending a fake invitation for a Swiss TV interview. Fahey said they were offering a $3,000 fee, but de Hory ultimately decided against it. The next day, Fahey and de Hory were taken by the police in the hotel lobby. When Fahey was released, he searched for a lawyer. LeGros had, according to Fahey, phoned the police and told them that de Hory had made death threats against him. LeGros had to pay $100,000 or he would be murdered. On the day of the hearing, LeGros' lawyers didn't show up. The judge, said Fahey, questioned LeGros about the plan to lure de Hory with a fake interview. LeGros said he had only wanted to scare him. When the judge asked LeGros what time he had received the phone call about the extortion, LeGros said he didn't know. He said, "I never look at my watch. If I want to know the time, I hold out my arm and have my servants read me the time. Why else should one have servants?" De Hory was released. The next year, LeGros escaped to Brazil and was arrested after his arrival in Rio de Janeiro. He was held for almost a year before being extradited to France. Later, LeGros wrote a book and claimed de Hory didn't paint a thing. And Réal Lassard, the young Canadian who had allied himself with LeGros, also wrote a book claiming that he was the true master forger, not de Hory. They suddenly wanted de Hory's story for themselves. The harassment, however, didn't stop after Geneva. In Ibiza, Fahey one day came home to find a window broken near the entrance. He went in and found Lassard. This was the second time Réal Lassard had broken in. Several years before, when de Hory and Fahey were in London, Lassard had turned up to the house with police. De Hory's house guests were kicked out. The house had been put in LeGros' name as part of the conditions of their business arrangement in the early 60s. Before the Meadows scandal, LeGros used this as an excuse to take over the house every so often. Once, he moved in while de Hory was out of town and grew irritated by the dog. LeGros just gave the dog away. De Hory tried to get it back without success. But this time, as Fahey stood in the doorway staring down the intruder, he decided to relent. Fahey said Lassard had presented fake papers to the court, claiming himself to be the owner of the house. De Hory was already in the process of moving to another house in the countryside of Ibiza. He wanted to get away from LeGros and Lassard, cut his last tie with them. Most of their belongings were in storage, ready for the move, so Fahey left. Even after they moved out, though, de Hory couldn't escape his troubles. Several times he had faced extradition requests from France. In 1974, He was imprisoned in Palma, but when there was not enough evidence for the extradition, he was released. De Hory was always aware of the threat looming over him. By 1976, de Hory was tired. France had issued a new extradition request. Lassard claimed de Hory was responsible for forging customs stamps and documents. De Hory was quiet as the request slowly made its way through the courts. In Madrid, later that year, de Hory had his most high-profile exhibition. Isidro Clot's gallery was a huge space with dark velvet drapes. The paintings were suspended in the air. For he remembered de Hory's work was hung in gilded frames and spotlit. As with the other exhibitions, Clot insisted that the pieces be in the style of other artists. He wasn't interested in de Hory's own work. De Hory still couldn't outshine his infamy. He would say he was famously infamous. But the show was a big event. It was covered by the gossip magazine Hola. They included photographs of de Hory wearing an extravagant cape, with Ursula Andrés by his side. The magazine made no mention of de Hory's criminal past. It described the famous painter Elmyr de Hory, who arrived with the famous actress Ursula Andrés. The 3-paragraph article only mentioned de Hory once after that, in passing, as Andrés's great friend. The rest of the article focused on Andrés and the attendance of the Duke and Duchess of Cadiz. Even the photos are more focused on the royalty and the movie star, giving Andrés a solo photo in the spread. De Hory is shown in the periphery, his artworks not at all. But to him, the show was a success. He wanted nothing more than the glamour of famous actresses and European royalty gathered to celebrate him. But in the late summer or early fall, a stranger came to visit de Hory at home. For he answered the door, one of his many duties. The man told de Hory that Le Gros wanted him to know that if de Hory ever ended up in a French jail, he would be killed. Judges in Palma de Mallorca, the capital of the Spanish Balearic Islands, convened on December 7th to discuss Elmyr de Hory's third extradition. It was not a judgment on guilt, only on the merit of extradition. Forhy and de Hory's new house did not have a phone, and early on the morning of December 11th, 1976, Forhy drove up the hill in a little hatchback to the small village nearby. Evelyn Archer, a friend who knew the judges, had promised to relay their decision to him. Forhy waited by the payphone, which stood beside a whitewashed church. He stepped forward and called Archer. When she picked up, she began to cry. Forhy went back to the house and sat down in a chair and wept. De Hory, who was normally immaculately groomed in the mornings, was unshaven and wearing his pajamas and robe. Seeing Forhy in tears, he understood. De Hory walked to the kitchen and told the housekeeper to go home for the day. He went over to Forhy and, putting a hand on his shoulder, comforted him. Forhy remembered there was this quiet resignation in him, that he had already made up his mind. De Hory said, "The thing about life is that we can always exit when we want to." Forhy tried to tell him, "Don't do this. We can fight the extradition. We can go to Morocco and fight the extradition." But de Hory said no. He wasn't going to flee. "I've had a good life," he said, and went upstairs. Following him up, Forhy begged him to stop, tears in his eyes. De Hory embraced him and said, "Don't make this harder than it already is." De Hory instructed him to send out several letters he had written to friends and kissed him goodbye. Forhy sat downstairs, crying. "I was torn," he said. "I didn't want to see him that way either. The ignominy of him being arrested and shackled and dragged off to prison. And I didn't want to lose him." Forhy drove into town to tell his friend, Guillemette Jurias. They rushed back and ran up the stairs. De Hory had taken a handful of sleeping pills with cognac and was lying on the bed. Forhy leaned in. "Elmyr," he said. De Hory's eyes struggled open. Forhy said, "I could see there was a totally vacant look in his eyes. He saw me, but there wasn't a glimmer of recognition. he was transitioning out. They carried him down the stairs and out of the house. Fahey sat in the back seat of the hatchback, cradling de Hory's limp body. As they sped to the hospital, Elmyr de Hory died in Mark Fahey's arms. He was 65. Fahey was alone. De Hory had given the young American's life so much meaning. He had shaped Fahey and introduced him to a world that he couldn't imagine leaving. Now he didn't know where to go. He couldn't stay in Ibiza. His tie to the island had been severed. But if he returned to the US, he would be leaving this life behind. He felt like a stranger now, stuck between two places. De Hory had been his home for the last 7 years. In his will, de Hory named Mark Fahey his sole heir. Everything had been left to him. With nowhere else to go, Fahey packed away all of their belongings and went back to the US. He had arrived in Ibiza with a small backpack and left with 3 tons of crates. Fahey returned to a home and family who no longer recognized him, who didn't seem to care about his adventures with the great art forger. He put away all of de Hory's drawings and paintings, rolling them up and stuffing many of them under the bed, and didn't talk about his greatest friend for decades. As quickly as it had ended, it was as if it had never happened. Elmyr de Hory, it seemed, had vanished. But almost as soon as de Hory died, strange things began to happen. Details emerged that would muddle and complicate the question, who is Elmyr de Hory? And when, years and years later, Fahey decided to take out those canvases and rummage around the past of the man who had meant so much to him, he would upturn a history that would change everything. 4. The story we get. When Clifford Irving realized Elmyr de Hory was an art forger, he was at that moment searching for a book idea. A novelist from New York, Irving lived in Ibiza, and the two knew each other. When the scandal broke in 1967, they agreed that Irving would tell de Hory's tale. Irving listened as de Hory described his upbringing in Budapest high society, his wealthy parents, the servants, and horse-drawn carriages. He told Irving about the woman in Paris who had mistaken his drawing for a Picasso, and his adventures in America, selling masterpieces to fools who filled the country's museums with his work. Fake, the story of Elmyr de Hory, the greatest art forger of our time, became a bestseller, and the two almost immediately fell out. De Hory demanded his cut of the royalties. Irving wrote to de Hory, "You could starve to death on a street corner and I wouldn't give you a dime," according to Mark Fahey, who was assisting with all of de Hory's correspondence at the time. Meanwhile, Irving's publisher was eager for his next project. The unremarkable novelist had become the publisher's hottest biographer. Obligingly, Irving presented them with the literary opportunity of the century: ghostwriting the autobiography of the wildly mysterious, reclusive millionaire Howard Hughes. Hughes was once the most famous man in the world. A tycoon of Hollywood and aviation, he dated stars like Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, and Rita Hayworth. His movies were notoriously expensive, some of the biggest budgets Hollywood had seen. He shut down production halfway through his mammoth World War I epic, Hell's Angels. He decided the silent film should be a talkie, and they started production all over again with a new leading lady. In his aviation career, he set a world record in 1938 by flying around the world in 91 hours. In the 1940s, he spent $22 million of government funds on developing the largest amphibious airplane. Meant as part of the war effort, the prototypes were only completed 2 years after the war ended. Even then, the thing barely flew. $22 million in the 1940s, and it flew just a mile with a pitiful altitude of 70 feet. Hughes was called before the Senate War Investigating Committee to explain himself. Over time, his eccentricities turned into what is obvious today as severe mental health problems. He was paranoid and a germaphobe and would spend months alone in his screening room. He moved into hotels and refused to wear clothes. In Las Vegas, he cut himself off from the world and became a total recluse. Every so often, stories would surface. Had he really bought an entire Las Vegas hotel just because the neon light was shining into his room? After years and years, Howard Hughes turned into a myth, like a fairy tale creature or a character from a novel. The legends grew. Where was he? What was he doing? No one could know. So when Clifford Irving said Hughes wanted him to write his life story, his publisher couldn't believe their luck. Hughes had read Irving's book about de Hory. Hughes said he had been so impressed by Irving's fair and honest treatment of his subject that he wanted him to write his life story. McGraw-Hill quickly put together contracts for Irving and Hughes and paid a whopping $750,000 advance, an unheard of sum at the time. Hughes said all contact with the publisher had to go through Irving, the only person he trusted, and that his checks must be written out to H.R. Hughes. The book became the literary sensation of the season. Irving went on talk shows and described his secret meetups with Hughes in Mexico and Puerto Rico. The anticipation for the book was huge. Here's the problem. The entire thing was a sham. Irving had invented it all. He forged documents. He faked letters by Hughes that were verified by handwriting experts. He also forged letters from people in Hughes's life, all of which were conveniently no longer alive to authenticate. With his partner in crime, Richard Susskind, Irving studied Hughes's speech style, and the two would sit and literally act out fake interviews to transcribe before then destroying the tapes. To make his inventions and forgeries work, Irving did so much research into Hughes's life that he might as well have just written an honest biography. Then, Irving's wife took the check made out to H.R. Hughes and used a fake passport to open a Swiss bank account under the name Helga R. Hughes. Irving thought Hughes would never find out, or that if he did, it wouldn't affect the book. It's easy to dismiss an eccentric recluse, but Hughes did find out. The mysterious millionaire who no one had heard from in years decided to hold a press conference. In January 1972, a small group of journalists sat at a semicircular table in the Sheraton Universal Hotel in North Hollywood. In the center was a speaker. From his secret hotel room in the Bahamas, Howard Hughes telephoned in. The frail, disembodied voice said, "Well, this must go down in history. I only wish I were still in the movie business because I don't remember any scripts as wild or as stretching of the imagination as this yarn has turned out to be." The reporters asked him directly about Irving. "I never saw him. I never even heard of him until a matter of days ago, when this thing first came to my attention." Like that, the whole thing had been exposed. The reporters, still in shock they were actually talking to Hughes, asked him more questions. Were his hair and beard and fingernails as long and scraggly as the rumors say? What follows is a long, detailed description of how Hughes cuts his fingernails. In case you're wondering, he's never had a manicure and uses clippers, not scissors. Initially, the publishers McGraw-Hill were convinced that the conference itself was a hoax, an imposter pretending to be Hughes. But by January 28th, Irving confessed and gave back the money. He was sent to jail and went bankrupt soon after. The entire escapade was turned into a movie in 2006, starring Richard Gere as Irving. Irving, for his part, had the fabulous gall to disown the film and ask that his name be removed from the credits. His reason? The movie wasn't faithful enough to the truth. It should be noted that the anticipated release of the Howard Hughes biography may have been one of the instigating factors behind the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. Yes, Irving may have been partly responsible for Watergate. H.R. Haldeman, aide to President Richard Nixon, and White House counsel John Dean have both suggested that Nixon was worried that the book would expose financial ties between himself and Hughes, and he wanted to find out what the Democrats knew. Time magazine wrote an article about the Clifford Irving scandal. In a brilliantly witty flourish, they commissioned Elmyr de Hory to do a portrait of Irving for their cover, which ran with the headline, "Con Man of the Year." It was the greatest fraud of the literary world, inspired perhaps by his time spent with the greatest fraudster of the art world. Did Clifford Irving look at Elmyr de Hory's life of forgery and think, I could do that? But then again, what if the Howard Hughes endeavour was not his first venture into biographical forgery? Did he start writing fake non-fiction after he wrote de Hory's biography? Or during? At a moment when de Hory most needed to take charge of the narrative, facing criminal charges and disgrace, Irving gave him the chance to tell the world the answer to the ever-nagging question, who is Elmyr? Irving's book is the story de Hory wanted to tell about himself. The narrative of the aristocratic artist who became a forger and made fools of the art world. Simultaneously the victim of those around him and triumphant in his defeat of them. It is true that for a lot of his book on the art forger, Irving took de Hory at his word. He listened to the stories and rendered them in prose fit for a thriller. Many dates were changed, locations altered, characters renamed, and the chronology made deliberately elusive. But did the two conspire? Sometimes we tell stories about ourselves, about who we'd like to be. Those stories aren't always the truth. We improve on the truth, sometimes cover it up. But no matter how much we tell that story, the one we want others to tell, it can hit the hard reality that the story we want is not always the story we get. Elmyr de Hory wasn't permitted a proper funeral, said Mark Fahey. Suicide was considered a sin, and de Hory's lawyer, Mariano Llobet, made arrangements for the service to be snuck between funerals. His gravestone identifies him simply as Elmyr, like the signature he put on his paintings. Almost immediately, rumours on the island flourished. People claimed they were with de Hory on his final day. Others said de Hory hadn't intended to kill himself, but wanted to be hospitalised in the hopes of avoiding extradition. And some, like Clifford Irving, played with the idea that he had faked his death. He couldn't help, even in de Hory's death, to put his own spin on it, create a dramatic fiction. Mark Fahey left with around 300 paintings, drawings and portfolios by de Hory. They were his pastiches, originals, doodles and sketches, as well as the Philip de Laszlo portrait of de Hory and his brother as young boys in sailor suits. Many pieces were still in Madrid for the exhibition, and Fahey never saw them again. When he arrived back in the US, the sudden change made him experience a kind of reverse culture shock. As he put it in his memoir, social etiquette didn't count for much in the drive-thru at a fast food joint. No one I knew would appreciate puns in French. When he met Europeans, he would revert back to what he called fake hand-kissing mode. Fahey wasn't around princesses anymore. He soon stopped. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he saw some drawings that he described as eerily like Elmyr's. His return to Minnesota was difficult. His family no longer recognized their son, who had affected a British accent and wore a cravat. He planned to go to California to continue his studies, but in the end he stayed in Minnesota. He searched for jobs at art galleries, but eventually took a position as a security guard at Honeywell. No one was interested in his years spent with the world's most famous art forger, so he stopped talking about it. The silence continued for a year, and then 2, which turned into a decade, and then several. Eventually, his years in Ibiza with Elmyr de Hory felt like they had never happened. Sometimes friends would comment on a piece hanging on his wall that looked a bit like a Matisse or a Picasso. He didn't go into detail. In 2002, 25 years after returning to the US, Faughey met Alice Doll. On a date, Faughey mentioned that he had been to Europe in his 20s. Doll perked up. She said, "I also travelled around Europe." At his home, she noticed the paintings. When she asked about them, Faughey said, "Nobody wants to hear about this." But Doll did. By now, Faughey was in his 50s. His flop of hair was greying, and the young man who lived in Ibiza with the great art forger was a distant memory. 2 years later, they got married. It was her first and his third. One day, Faughey was contacted by a filmmaker who was researching a documentary on forgery. To help the filmmaker get a sense of the personalities involved in de Hory's life, Faughey began writing character profiles. He sketched out each person and what he remembered of them. He told anecdotes and described witticisms. It felt good. The young Faughey was coming back to him. The time of his life that gave him so much meaning was illuminating his world again. Doll told him to keep writing. "You have a story," she said. "Why don't you write it?" As the memories came, he wrote them down. He reimagined his travels and the bizarre parties and the aphorisms that de Hory would impart. The resulting book was self-published after 5 years. The Forger's Apprentice, Life with the World's Most Notorious Artist. It tells the story of de Hory's life, taken predominantly from de Hory's accounts and Irving's book. The second half is a memoir recounting Faughey's time with Elmyr de Hory. Faughey describes his memories and what he learnt from de Hory about art and history, his critiques of the art market, and the importance of aesthetic value. The book is delightful. Faughey is clearly having fun, with, by his own admission, metaphors so elaborate that at times it's possible to forget where the sentence started. Faughey jokes about it now. He said if you take out all the metaphors, it might only be half the length. After decades of silence, writing out his experiences brought a new purpose. What started as a curiosity to jot down a few memories had opened up something new for Faughey. After he published the book, he adapted it into a play, which was staged at the 2013 Minnesota Fringe Festival. He then adapted the play into a musical in 2015, written with his friend Kevin Bowen. It includes such songs as Fake, Fraud, Forger. Back when he was first writing his book, Doll put Faughey in touch with Don Myers, the director of the Hillstrom Museum of Art, part of the Gustavus Adolphus College near their home outside Minneapolis. Myers was interested in Elmyr de Hory's story and wanted to put on an exhibition. It would focus on his pastiches and include 2 genuine Matisse and Modigliani drawings for comparison. There were a few de Hory originals, non-fakes, as well as the painting of de Hory and his brother in their little sailor suits by Philip de Laszlo, the painter of royalty. Elmyr de Hory, Artist and Faker, was displayed in 2010. Another curator, Colette Lowell, was interested in the story too and wanted to feature de Hory in her own exhibition about forgery. For the next few years, lending to various exhibitions would become part of Faughey's new role. He gave lectures for them, recounted his experiences, and helped the curators with their research. Faughey told me, "His work was going up in museums. I'm doing what I should be doing, curating his collection." The canvases and portfolios that had been rolled up and stuffed silently under his bed were now hanging in museums and provided Faughey with a living link to his friend. He had a new purpose. Faughey had become the caretaker of de Hory's legacy and the greatest authority on his work. Faughey said, "He basically created the person that you see before you. It's hard to say what course my life would have taken without his impact. I feel I'm a much richer person for it." There was the exhibition, Intent to Deceive, in 2014, and Treasures on Trial in 2017. More and more, people were learning the name Elmyr de Hory. A small market emerged for the work of the famous art forger. People were interested in buying de Hory's art. Fahey said, "For me, it's more of an acknowledgement that his work still garners interest and still has commercial value. It's a reminder to me that his original objective can still be achieved half a century later." Fahey could celebrate de Hory the way de Hory had wanted to be celebrated, through museums and galleries, and by selling de Hory's work, which Fahey does through his website, Elmyr.net. Now, Fahey's home looks like a museum. So much has been taken out from storage, and every space on the wall from floor to ceiling is covered in works of art. They hang along the staircase, in closets, and behind doors. Picassos, Matisses, Modiglianis, all looking down. There's a large portrait of Fahey as a young man. His home has become a kind of shrine to his friend. A bronze bust of the artist stands in the corner, a tiny smirk twisting his mouth. But soon a new role, a more surprising one, would take shape. And it would put Fahey in a very strange position. It was 2007 when Fahey first noticed some unusual pieces by de Hory appearing online. He got a notification from eBay. The painting had the distinct style of Modigliani. It was a portrait of a woman in earthy tones, a slender neck, and elongated features, and those eyes, longing and sad. It was on sale for $7,000. Interested in any pieces by de Hory on sale, Fahey wanted to reach out. Perhaps the seller had a link to de Hory's past. But something was off. The description did not add up. The seller, who went by Stanley, claimed in the description that he had personally commissioned pieces from de Hory in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Fahey thought that didn't make sense. By that time, de Hory had been outed and he was no longer doing forgeries. If it were from that period, it could only be a pastiche. But the painting was signed Modigliani. The seller claimed that de Hory had signed the back of the canvas with his own name. This also didn't add up, Fahey thought. When he sold his pastiches, de Hory would always sign his own name on the front to ensure that there was no chance of it being peddled as genuine. The dimensions and size of the canvas were not consistent with what de Hory used. It didn't make sense. But it led to one conclusion. This piece was not by de Hory. Was the seller mistaken? Or was this a deliberate attempt to pass off a painting as if it had been made by de Hory? A fake of a fake? A forged forgery? Forrest Fenn decided one day to put $2 million worth of antiques and treasure in an actual treasure chest and hide it somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. In 2010, he wrote a memoir that included a poem offering a series of cryptic clues that would lead the reader to the treasure. Naturally, this developed a cult following, and legions of Fenn treasure hunters searched deserts and mountains to find the treasure chest. Several people died in their search, and finally, in June 2020, Fenn announced that the chest had been found, apparently in Wyoming. But long before the treasure hunts, back in the 1980s, Fenn teamed up with John Connolly, the former governor of Texas and the 1980 presidential hopeful. Back when Connolly was the governor, he had sat behind John F. Kennedy in the Dallas motorcade when he was shot in 1963. A bullet actually passed through Kennedy and hit Connolly. Fenn was a high-profile collector who dealt mainly in Native American art, and Connolly approached him with an unusual plan. Connolly had been in Saudi Arabia when he heard about a large collection of paintings by the most notorious art forger of the 20th century, Elmyr de Hory. According to Fenn's blog, the two of them flew to London to meet with a man who had been a pawnbroker in Ibiza, Bill Talbot. Talbot sold the two Americans 100 paintings in the style of Gauguin, Van Gogh, Modigliani, Matisse, and Picasso for $225,000. All of them were purportedly by de Hory. As Fenn tells it, on the plane back to the US, Connolly turned to Fenn and said, "Well, Forrest, we've got all these forgeries. Now how are we going to get rid of them?" Fenn was proud of his forgeries and wanted to sell them as de Hory's. A small article in Time magazine said Fenn was selling the paintings for up to $15,000 each. Fenn is quoted as saying, "If they're as good as real, then what the hell are we talking about? I mean, what is art?" Well, the Art Dealers Association of America clearly thought they were not. The president of the association sent Fenn a letter saying he ought to, in Fenn's words, educate the public that a forged painting certainly wasn't art. Fenn replied that he was not a schoolteacher, and it was not up to him to define what art was. On his blog years later, Fenn said the paintings went for $4,500 each. He wrote, "After all, if you see what looks like a painting worth $40 million on a rich man's wall, you don't ask him if it's real, do you?" The problem is that his entire collection of forgeries was, in itself, fake. They had not been made by Elmyr de Hory. He liked that these purportedly great paintings were actually by a well-known art forger. But it turned out they weren't even by him. What happens when you fall in love with a story, only to find the story you want isn't the truth? Works falsely attributed to de Hory have appeared in the US, the UK, across Europe, and even as far as New Zealand. Some sellers tell a tale about how they were acquired, but all attempt to dazzle and distract with stories of the greatest art forger of all time. Forging a work by a well-known forger is unlikely to invite much scrutiny, much like de Hory's fake studies or sketches. Try to pass off a Matisse, every brushstroke and canvas thread will be examined. Try to pass off a de Hory, it's likely to get not much more than a glance. No one is looking for consistency of style or subject or palette or technique because, well, it's a forger. Aren't they meant to be a chameleon? And the provenance, that chain of proof showing how the artwork travelled from the artist to the seller, that's already murky when it comes to a forger. So the story is malleable. It can be bent and shaped in whatever way the seller wants. It might seem like poetic justice for a forger to end up as the subject of forgery, that he might be exploited in much the same way he exploited others. Some will say this is probably what a forger deserves. But Mark Fahey is deeply troubled by the increasing appearance of fake de Horys. He notes the irony, but considers them a gross injustice. "Elmyr was always attempting mightily to champion the intrinsic merit of art, as opposed to having a name tag on it," said Fahey. "It is ironic that because Elmyr established a name for himself, all the other would-be fakers have picked this low-hanging fruit." Except that, of course, de Hory made a name by forging, by using the names of others. But de Hory always elevated himself to the level of those he forged. These fake forgeries, though, were bringing de Hory down. What Fahey sees as most egregious are the fake forgeries that have no interest in quality and imitate styles that have nothing to do with de Hory. They slap his name on as a cheap way to garner a few extra dollars. On his website, Fahey points to one criminally bad fake de Hory. It shows a young boy in a straw hat, seated by a cornfield, eating a watermelon, a little dog by his side. The style was wrong, the subject was wrong. Fahey said, "It's a god-awful ugly painting, and it has nothing to do with Elmyr or anything he's ever painted." Fahey wrote on his website about it, "This wretched work attributed to Elmyr has appeared numerous times for sale on eBay, over my consistent objections about its misattribution and my complaints to the seller. It demonstrates the ineffectual measures and lack of due diligence online or traditional auction houses take to protect consumers from fraud." Fahey scours the internet for fake de Horys. It frustrates him that he is the one left to filter them out. When he finds something that isn't right, he will send the auction house an email. For example, he wrote in January 2019 to Chiswick Auctions in London. The email reads, "Please note that the etching in the manner of Picasso attributed to Elmyr de Hory is not by him." He introduces himself as de Hory's secretary and heir, and continues, "There is simply no empirical evidence linking this print to de Hory. In view of this fact, I respectfully request that you remove it from your upcoming sale." The auction houses typically do. Fawley said he can tell whether a piece is a fake de Hory forgery by noting the materials that are used. When there are photos of the back of the canvas, he compares it to the materials he knows de Hory bought when the two of them would go to art shops in Madrid. He looks closely at the palette and the style, knowing well the colours and brushwork of his old friend. Fawley also looks closely at the hands in the painting to see if he can recognise de Hory's touch. If these methods all sound a little familiar, they should. It's exactly the same method of connoisseurship that authenticators use to sniff out a fake, including those by de Hory. Fawley has become the de facto authenticator of de Hory's work. He determines which fakes are real and which fakes are fake fakes. And with his authority as the expert on Elmyr de Hory, he contacts the auction house and declares these fake fakes are fake. But de Hory had a passionate hatred for authenticators. Fawley has become the very expert that de Hory spent his life eluding, and for whom he had nothing but contempt. De Hory formed a whole personality around how stupid and foolish and easily duped these authenticators were.
The obvious irony that resounds like a ringing bell again and again and again is that I end up policing the marketplace for fake fakes, said Fawley. I just want to get the record straight, because some of the purported fakes are so miserable and so bad, they have nothing to do with him or his style. So I feel a certain fidelity to make sure that he is given his proper due in regard to works that he created, whether they're in his own style or in the manner of.
Every artist deserves an authenticator, an expert protector guarding the integrity of their work. Matisse, Picasso, Modigliani, Derain, they have plenty of people protecting them. Just because de Hory proved their experts to be fallible, does that mean that de Hory doesn't deserve someone looking out for him? If Fawley doesn't champion his friend's work and foil the attempts to taint his reputation, disrupt the history, and exploit his name, then probably no one will. He is the one caretaker of de Hory's legacy, the lone guardian looking out for his friend. Who will look out for Elmyr de Hory, if not Mark Fawley? Fawley has come, on occasion, face to face with fake de Horys. In 2010, Owen Jacobs invited Fawley to see his collection. Jacobs was the CEO of several corporations and the one-time co-owner of the Minnesota Vikings. At his home, Fawley said, Jacobs showed him about 20 paintings in the style of Modigliani. Jacobs said they were by de Hory, saying, "You can't tell the difference." Fawley looked at the paintings. He felt Jacobs was trying to pass the de Hory Modiglianis off as genuine Modiglianis. But he realized they weren't even genuine de Horys. Fawley said he tried to tell Jacobs that they were fake fakes, but Jacobs wasn't having it. Fawley didn't insist. If Jacobs was trying to pass them off as real Modiglianis, he thought, and they weren't even real de Horys, then the joke was on him. Jacobs died in 2019, so this story couldn't be confirmed, but Fawley said Jacobs bought them from a Santa Fe dealer named Forrest Fenn. When Fawley found out about Fenn, he looked him up. In Fawley's opinion, Fenn's entire collection of de Hory fakes was fake. He wrote to Fenn, who ignored him. Then, in 2015, Fawley said he was in Santa Fe and got word that Fenn would be happy to meet him, but only on the condition Fawley wouldn't denounce his collection as fake. Fawley declined. Fenn's situation was like a bizarre twist on what happened to Al Gore Meadows in Texas in the 60s. His entire collection was on the brink of being delegitimized, except Fenn's collection was meant to be fake. Then it turned out to be a fake collection. Fenn did not respond to any requests for an interview or comment. He later died in September 2020. The man from whom Fenn and Connolly bought their fake fakes was known to them as Bill Talbot. The man who actually provided the fakes was Ken Talbot. Perhaps it was a false name, perhaps Fenn misremembered. Talbot was a London bookkeeper who visited Ibiza where he met de Hory. Fahey remembered meeting Talbot just once, describing in his memoir that he resembled Michael Caine. His blue eyes, he said, were like olives in the bottom of a martini glass. Later, Talbot began peddling fake de Hory paintings, claiming they were by the infamous master forger. In 1991, he released a book, Enigma, the new story of Elmyr de Hory, the greatest art forger of our time. But the book was a page-for-page copy of Clifford Irving's biography of de Hory. He had taken Irving's book and republished it under his own name in order to help sell his con. He added photographs of fake fakes in the middle. The book is available on Amazon, where its one and only review is a 2-star entry from none other than Clifford Irving. The review was written in 2016, long after he was released from prison. It reads, "Ken Talbot was a London crook and bookmaker who in 1991 reproduced and published my 1968 biography, Fake, calling it Enigma. His hardback edition includes a preface by Clifford Irving, not a word of which I wrote." The review ends, "I give this $80 book a 2nd star only because my included text, that of the original Fake, is worth reading." Irving's Amazon profile includes reviews of items such as one of his own novels, which he calls a great book, garden weeders, 6-star knife, and toenail clippers, junk. Ever since 1986, Talbot had been trying to buy the rights to Clifford Irving's book, according to letters kept by Irving. He said it was for a reissue of the book, which, by that point, was out of print. In 1990, Talbot bought the rights for $12,500 and republished it under his own name. He added his own introduction, an epilogue, and appendices. His original editions explained and validated the provenance for the fake fakes, inventing a story about his friendship with de Hory. So just to summarize, in order to sell his own fakes of a forger's forgeries, Ken Talbot faked a book by taking a biography about a forger that was itself a fake story. It's a fake version of a fake book that tells a fake story about a faker in order to sell fake fakes. In the introduction and epilogue, he recounts meeting de Hory, describing him as mutton dressed up as lamb. He tells a story of being invited into de Hory's studio to view several paintings for purchase. Fahey disputes that de Hory did this. No one was ever allowed into the studio unless, like Fahey, they were sitting for him. But Talbot, opting for intrigue and dramatic flair, describes the studio as having a literal secret panel in the wall that slid open when a button was pushed, as if it were the lair of a campy James Bond villain. Talbot claims that when he accepted de Hory's offer of £1,200, de Hory seemed irritated, perhaps realising he could have asked for more. Several weeks later, as Talbot tells it, de Hory needed a £5,000 loan. Uncertain of the forger's reliability, Talbot asked for collateral, and de Hory suggested more paintings. But Talbot wanted de Hory's signature removed. "I've finished with that life," de Hory said. Talbot tried to calm him down. He said that he would not sell them as genuine. His reasons for wanting the signature removed were purely aesthetic. He writes, "Every time I look at them, I'll see Elmyr grinning at me from the corner, whereas if I see Monet, Pissarro, and so on, it'll help me not to be so angry and to forget you." Talbot said he convinced de Hory. When, several years later, de Hory needed more money to fight an extradition request, he no longer put on any pretense and treated the paintings as if they were on commission. Of course, none of this is true. Certainly, Fahey disputed that Talbot ever met de Hory more than once, and said there's no chance de Hory did so many works for him. But Talbot claimed he regularly visited Ibiza, and once de Hory made a gift of several paintings. Talbot claims de Hory refused any payment, saying, "I want you to accept these old master paintings by me. Doing these taught me much more, and gave me a satisfaction I am looking for." This line doesn't make much sense, because de Hory wasn't known for forging the old masters, and Talbot wasn't trying to sell any in those styles. It's a bit weird. But when you're talking about fake forgeries in a fake epilogue in a book that is a fake version of a fake biography, it's kind of hard to find the logic. With this backstory established, Talbot includes a number of picture panels in the middle of his book. These are, of course, all pieces that he had made and was trying to sell. The authority of a book is always a good prop to sell a con, even if it's one he published himself. To explain the sudden appearances of Van Gogh, for example, a painter de Hory was not known for copying, there is an appendix in the back of the book. Talbot said they were from notebooks that de Hory had given to him. De Hory wanted them published one day and apparently thought Talbot was the right person to entrust this to. They conveniently included de Hory's thoughts on forgery and his philosophies on certain artists. In these notes, de Hory mentions his forging techniques. Most importantly for Talbot, he specifically mentions forging Van Gogh. The musings on art are suspiciously vague comments on line and colour. They read as if written by someone with only a passing knowledge of art. Because, of course, they had not been written by de Hory. At the end of the book's introduction, Talbot praises de Hory, saying that hopefully one day he will join his famous compatriots into the annals of history, and finishes by claiming that part of the proceeds from the book will go towards establishing the Elmyr de Hory Foundation to help fund art scholarship. Talbot likely manufactured his forgeries en masse in Asia. In 1994, he put on an exhibition in Tokyo consisting entirely of fake de Horys. You look at them, and the women in the Modiglianis actually look Japanese. It doesn't take an expert to see they weren't made by Amedeo Modigliani or Elmyr de Hory. Does it matter that there are fake fakes out there? If someone buys a painting by de Hory, would it matter if it turned out to be made by someone else? If they like it, or it means something to them, maybe it's better not to know, not to have an illusion shattered, a symbol robbed of power. But what if it were a Picasso? Would you want to know? Would you like it less if it turned out to be fake? Perhaps it would be better not to know. That's what de Hory always said. If people like it, what does it matter if it's by someone else? And what about lies that are more personal, about someone close to you? What if someone you loved wasn't who you thought they were? Would you want to know? Maybe there's no harm in letting someone live blissfully unaware. But for history, it matters. That's why Fauhy finds these fake fakes unforgivable. They're disrupting the record, corrupting the narrative. And that's true of all forgeries, even the fake ones. De Hory once said, "I don't feel bad for Modigliani, I feel good for me. He worked very little, he died very early, so if I added a few paintings or a few drawings, it's not going to destroy his oeuvre, not in the least." But de Hory made so many forgeries in the style of Modigliani that experts are still untangling the mess today. Some say it may be impossible to compile a definitive list of all Modigliani's work. Over the years, Modigliani catalogues have repeatedly featured works that were discovered to be forgeries. He's been dead for over 100 years, and historians are still trying to make sense of Modigliani's short career mangled by de Hory. History is fragile. Some ruptures never repair. Some lies disrupt the narrative for good and cast doubt on everything. Fauhy is hoping to protect the history of someone who spent his life damaging the history of others. The strangeness of that will never go away. And it may be just as strange to acknowledge that part of it makes sense. Fauhy is focused on sharing his friend's story. By celebrating him, Fauhy can protect him. But while Fauhy rummaged around his friend's past, he found a different story than he was expecting. It would change the narrative and complicate the history yet again. And Mark Fauhy's understanding of who Elmyr de Hory was would change completely.
Epilogue. The Real Elmyr. Mark Forhey can still remember the day Elmyr de Hory unrolled the Philip de Laszlo painting. The surface of the paint cracked from years in storage. The two little boys in sailor suits, the younger, unmistakably de Hory, his little elfin face a mischievous smile. Made by the painter of royalty, the de Laszlo painting was the last relic of his upbringing in the Hungarian aristocracy. De Hory had hung it proudly in Ibiza. Forhey brought it back to the US and after many years unrolled it again. He put it up in his home, just in front of the entrance, so it's the first thing you see as you enter. The painting appeared in the 2010 exhibit Elmyr de Hory, Artist and Faker. But the de Laszlo Foundation had its doubts. A restorer who had worked on de Laszlo's took one look at it and said, "Not even close." Forhey insisted it was genuine. De Hory had said so. Then, in 2013, Forhey took it to the Midwest Art Conservation Center. David Marcus was the head of the Painting Conservation Lab. He said, "I was suspicious the minute I looked at it." Marcus said, "I definitely got the impression from Mark that he really wanted to believe it was authentic." After the analysis, Marcus telephoned Forhey. He said the scans revealed that the faces and signature had been painted on top of an existing painting, which de Hory had likely picked up at a flea market. It was just another one of de Hory's fakes. The first lies about de Hory's life came to light almost immediately after his death. De Hory had always said he had no family left. He insisted that his brother had died in the 1930s in a car racing accident, and that his mother had been shot by Russian soldiers as they stole her coat. The rest of his family had died in the Holocaust, he said. Forhey had met only de Hory's cousin, who spoke no English. Forhey could see there was tension between the two when they spoke in Hungarian. But after de Hory died, Forhey found out that the man introduced as de Hory's cousin was in fact his brother. He hadn't died in a racing accident, and the two had been in regular contact. De Hory's mother, it also turned out, had not been killed and was alive during the 60s, trying to get hold of him. For one of the exhibitions, art experts Jeffrey Taylor and Andrea Mejes, as well as Colette Lowell, the curator, went to Budapest. They researched de Hory's upbringing and tracked down his birth certificate. It turned out de Hory's family was fully Jewish, not half Jewish, half Catholic as he had claimed. He had been born in 1906, not 1911, which means he was 70 when he died, not 65. His father, the certificate said, had not been an ambassador, but a tradesperson. They were not socialites who had lived in a palace in Buda, but a lower middle-class family from Pest. There were no horses and carriages in de Hory's childhood, and no servants and silverware as he had described to Forhey and Irving. He was not an aristocrat. His name wasn't even Elmyr de Hory. His name was Elmyr Hoffman. Each realization chipped away at the illusion de Hory had spent his life creating. Forhey struggled to make sense of it, to have both ideas competing in his mind, the man he had known and the man he was finding in these documents. The entire basis of de Hory's personality was his claim to aristocracy. It informed his art and social life, the way he interacted with people and what he valued. It had all been a fiction. So many of the tales de Hory had told about himself, the narratives he'd created, were as fictional as his forgeries. People who knew Forhey kept waiting for him to get upset or angry, but he never did. He said he wasn't hurt by the lies. He said, "I think a lot of people, when push comes to shove, will shelve their ethics and morality in order to do what is necessary to survive." De Hory, he thinks, adopted his persona to make things easier. He needed to create this fictional version of himself to get through life. Forhey is just disappointed. He said, "I was the closest person to him, and he never felt comfortable enough to confide in me the truth."
Forhy wonders if maybe de Hory worried that if he told the truth, Forhy would think less of him. Which of course he wouldn't, and he doesn't think less of him now. Forhy just repeats a phrase de Hory used to say, "My friend, right or wrong." The story of how Elmyr Hoffman became Elmyr de Hory is one that remains full of unknowns. Taylor interviewed the wife of de Hory's cousin, Edith Tenner, who was 100 years old and a survivor of Auschwitz. She said Hoffman's obsession with aristocracy likely came from admiring his grandfather, who owned a brick factory in Bled, in what is now Romania. His grandfather lived in a large, grand house and was a well-known, respected figure in the town. Taylor told me, "Elmyr probably got his ideas about aristocracy from the fact that his grandfather did own the brick factory in town. And so, although not having a title, he was still a very well-respected and regarded man." His cousin said that de Hory was spoiled as a child. He didn't work when he was older, but was always in awe of the authority of his grandfather. In the 1920s, as a teenager, Hoffman went to an art school in Transylvania and likely learned to paint landscapes. Then, in the mid-20s, he went to Munich and studied at the studio of Moritz Heimann, a German impressionist and well-known art teacher. Young artists from the UK and US would often come to study under him. Two such students were Lucille Enders, an American, and William Savin, the man who would one day become her husband. In her letters, she wrote of a Hungarian boy, Der Klein Hoffmann, or Little Hoffman. He was 17 years old. "He is very talented," she wrote. "Professor Heimann has great hope for his future. I like his work very much, but the boys can't tolerate him or his work. I think they are just a little jealous." In February, she wrote that Heimann even threw a studio ball in Hoffman's honor. The other students would have been older, in their 20s, and so this young, talented teenager was a strange addition. He became friends with the two Americans, who spoke to him in German since he did not speak English. Enders wrote that his mother is of the nobility and his father is a wealthy businessman, and are divorced, and the boy travels from one city to another. This means that he was lying about himself from an early age, perhaps a desire to fit in or impress his older classmates. Did it start as a harmless exaggeration, a game of make-believe? Whatever it was, the fiction continued for the rest of his life and beyond. Enders, Savin, and Hoffman travelled together in the spring of 1924. Hoffman spoke Italian and helped them get around. It's a strange picture to think of these two Americans who were in the early days of their courtship, travelling around with this young Hungarian boy. Several times Hoffman had to borrow money. Eventually they parted ways, and the Americans headed back to Munich. From there, Enders writes to her family, "I have not heard a word from little Elmyr Hoffman. No one knows where he can be." She goes on to rattle off a long list of people who Hoffman, she had discovered, had borrowed money from, including Heimann, his teacher. She wrote, "There is no end to the fibs he has told." By 1927, Hoffman was already getting into trouble for fraud. He spent some time in jail for check fraud in Paris. He was put in jail in Berlin in 1928 for theft. He was jailed too in London and Zurich. According to Interpol, he was imprisoned 9 times in a 4-year period between 1927 and 1931. In the mid-30s, he stole from an actress who was modelling for him in Budapest. All in all, he committed check fraud and theft, used false documents, assumed false identities, and committed the crime of impersonating an aristocrat. Hoffman travelled a lot, and it is difficult to track down his movements. What he did during the war is a mystery, but his tales of being imprisoned and then escaping the Nazis are not true. By the time he had arrived in New York in 1948, he was using an entirely different name and was forging art. When Hoffman sat down with Clifford Irving as Elmyr de Hory, he had the chance to turn his fictions into truth. Just as Legros would place photos of fake paintings in real catalogues, Hoffman could legitimize his story with this book. He placed the tale of Elmyr de Hory into Irving's biography. He painted a fake version of his life as he wanted to be seen. The artist aristocrat turned master art forger. He claimed to have sold over 1,000 forgeries. Maybe that's true, or maybe an exaggeration. If you're going to tell a story, might as well make it a good one. His tales about Earl Stendhal and Paul Rosenberg, we might never know if they're true. Irving, whether in collusion or out of negligence, repeated the stories. They were printed and told over and over, in articles and books. Even Mark Forkey's book recounts de Hory's time in the US the way de Hory told it. There are parts of the story we will never know. De Hory lied about himself too much. Irving was too willing to go along with it. Orson Welles repeated the myth too, and Forkey accepted the word of his friend. De Hory's fear that he might be exposed was ultimately his downfall. His suicide may have had less to do with the threat of murder or jail. It's even possible that had he been taken to France, he wouldn't have been convicted. It may have had more to do with the fact that it would have exposed him as something far worse than an art forger, a common crook. For the first time since January 1948, Elmyr de Hory had a one-man show of his original work. In February 2020, 7 decades later, Forkey helped put together an exhibition of de Hory's portraiture. It showed a collection of oil paintings and drawings from his sketchbook. Some are half-finished, experiments, doodles.
"It's work trying to be no one other than himself," said Forkey. "There's no pretense." He added, "I want to leave behind the sensational tabloid worthiness of his story, and say there's really a rich trove of authentic Elmyr art available to see. These give better witness to Elmyr and his talents as an artist than anything that anyone elects to believe." The pieces are reminiscent of the artists he forged, and there's an uneasiness to them, as if, after all these years impersonating others, he doesn't quite know how to be himself. There's a self-portrait, the only one he made. It is painted in dark colours with thick brushstrokes. He looks tortured, his eyes opaque, and brow furrowed with deep lines. The painting is unfinished and was left uncompleted at the time of his death. It betrays a man uncertain of who he is, how he should present himself. In that, it is de Hory at his most honest. Forkey wants Elmyr de Hory to be remembered as an artist. Maybe now, with enough distance, his forgery and criminality will be only backstory, and he will become known for his original work. Forkey said, "If I can give him posthumously something of the recognition and dignity that he wasn't quite able to achieve in his lifetime, in my own way, I will be happy to do that as a gift and recognition for everything he had done for me. I am still owing him a debt of gratitude." But like the snowstorm in January 1948 that dampened the opening night in New York, the February snow in Minnesota made the opening a quiet, muted evening that finished early. The show then closed due to the coronavirus pandemic, and Forkey's lecture was cancelled. But Forkey was happy. He had done what he set out to do. "I'm finally paying the ultimate tribute to my friend," he said. Sometimes we tell stories. About ourselves, about others. The story we want told. Yet sometimes the story we want is not the story we get. Who is Elmyr? Is it possible that de Hory was intoxicated by the praise he received as a 17-year-old? The talented teenager in Professor Hyman's Munich studio? He saw himself as destined to be a great painter. But when confronted with the radically changing world, he didn't know what to do. He yearned for things to go back to the way they once were, and he never lived up to whatever expectation he set for himself. Once, when Forkey asked him if he felt he lacked any artistic tools, de Hory said, "Maybe imagination." Forgery may have been a way to survive, but it was also how he could vindicate himself,
change the story and prove he was as good as he thought he was destined to be. That was the story he was trying to tell himself. It was undercut when he was exposed, but he turned the story of the scandalized criminal into another story about a master art forger. He told his tales, and Irving published them, and many accepted them as the truth. We may never know what really happened, because for certain chapters of his life, all we have is de Hory's own myths. Although the truth, the one story he didn't want told, ultimately did come out. He wasn't an aristocratic artist. But by then, it didn't matter. The story had been told too many times. People still hang on to the story of the aristocratic art forger who filled the museums of America with his forgeries. The story is too irresistible to correct. Elmyr de Hory's stories have been repeated so many times, they've become real. If you hang them in a museum, and if they hang long enough, de Hory said about his forgeries, then they become real. If you tell a story enough times, it becomes the truth. De Hory did have an effect on the art world. His forgeries, whether they be in the hundreds or in the thousands, disrupted the market. The Art Dealers Association of America, which declared so much of Al Gore Meadows' collection fake, was founded in large part because of the proliferation of forgeries in the 1950s. Klaus Perls said the mess de Hory made was a considerable factor. Then, when the scandal broke, de Hory leaned into it and declared himself the greatest forger of the century. He spun tales so wild that museums all over the country began second-guessing their collections. Did they maybe, unknowingly, have a fake? His myth-making changed the way the art world saw itself. If a lie has tangible effects, is it as good as real? Does it matter if it's not? History is fragile. The smallest blemish can be repeated over and over until it alters our understanding for good. Who is Elmyr de Hory? It depends on who you ask.